beginning, God created the first humans, Adam and Eve. After God created the heavens and the earth, he looked around and thought the planet looked a little boring. So he decided to grow something and made Adam and Eve. But man, these two just wouldn't listen. God specifically told them not to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, but they listened to that damn snake and ate it anyway. The moment they did, they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which was basically a fully loaded penthouse suite. So what did Adam and Eve do after getting thrown out of their penthouse-level Garden of Eden? They had kids, obviously. Adam and Eve had kids, their kids had kids, and generations followed, and the Earth's population started to grow. But Adam and Eve's descendants were just as bad at listening to God. Just like their ancestors who disobeyed God and ate the apple, these guys wouldn't listen for shit. God watched them putting up with it until he finally had enough. These little shits are a lost cause. Time to format the human race. And then he tells them, since you won't fucking listen, I'm sending a flood. And what was that? It's the one and only Noah's Ark, that's what. God tells Noah to gather everyone in the neighborhood and get them on the ark. He tells them to warn them. If you don't, humanity is getting a hard reset. A flood is coming. But do the neighbors listen? When Noah tells them to get on the ark, they're like, that guy's nuts. There isn't a drop of rain in the sky, and he's building an ark and talking bullshit about God sending a flood. So they just ignore him. In the end, only Noah's family and pairs of every animal, like a buy one get one free deal, get on the ark and survive the Great Flood. Time passes, and the 10th generation descendant of this dude Noah is none other than Abraham, a name even people who don't go to church have probably heard. Abraham also had a shitload of kids. His descendants were super fertile, like they didn't have to worry about a declining birth rate. Starting with Grandpa Abraham, his descendants began to adopt a new faith. We, the descendants of Abraham, are the only people chosen by the one true God, Yahweh, from all of humanity. We are so grateful for being chosen. We are the best. They live by this belief. And what is it? This is the very beginning of Judaism, my friends. That's why Abraham is known as the father of the Jewish people. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac's son was Jacob. Jacob had kids too, of course. But this guy, Jacob, he was the problem. Polygamy was a thing back then, right? But Jacob had zero wisdom in managing his family life. If he had a fight with his wife, he should have been smart about it. Maybe buy her a designer bag, take her out to dinner, go on a trip. But he had none of that. He had a first wife and a second wife, and the problem was he doted on his second wife like crazy. And who was the son of this second wife? That's right, it's Joseph. You've heard that name a million times. If you know a Christian family, chances are you've met a kid named Joseph. This is that Joseph. The problem, like I said, was that Jacob adored his second wife while treating his first wife and her children like dirt. So they were pissed. The first wife was pissed, and Joseph's half-brothers were seriously pissed. So what'd they do? They sold Joseph to slave traders. A totally dysfunctional family, right? So these slave traders buy Joseph, and look here, guys, look at this rope tied around his ankle. Those goddamn bastards. And look at this asshole counting money. Anyway, they sell Joseph into slavery, and they sell him in Egypt. To be precise, Joseph was sold to slave traders who then sold him in Egypt. So Joseph gets hauled off to Egypt as a slave. But as you might have seen in the picture, the dude was ripped. He was handsome as hell, and he had a great personality. He was basically the perfect son-in-law that every parent dreams of. So, even though he was sold as a slave, which should have been the end of his life, he could have been stuck carrying heavy loads and doing chores until he died. Joseph was different because he was handsome, had a great personality, and had that main character plot armor from God. He caught the eye of Pharaoh's captain of the guard and became the overseer of his entire household. Sold as a slave, and he lands a job running the house of the king's captain of the guard. But like I said, Joseph was the whole package. Ripped, handsome, great personality. So the captain's wife tries to seduce him. But who is Joseph? He's our main character with plot armor. If he falls for that, the whole story falls apart, right? So, of course, he shuts her down. Ma'am, please don't do this. You can't do this to me. He pushes her away. And what happens? The captain's wife gets pissed and lies to her husband. Joseph tried to rape me. I was so scared. You need to mess him up. So, Joseph gets framed and thrown in prison. He was doomed to rot in jail for the rest of his life. Back then, a crime like sexual assault meant you'd either get your head cut off or spend your entire life in prison doing hard labor. But here comes the plot twist. He gets out of prison. How? The king of Egypt, the pharaoh, has a seriously fucked up dream. A dream so bizarre it made him think, is my kingdom about to collapse? It was the dream of a lifetime. So Pharaoh orders his men to find someone who can interpret it. And as it turns out, Joseph had already made a name for himself inside the prison for being an amazing dream interpreter. The rumor spread from the inmates to the guards and eventually all the way to the palace. So they pull Joseph out of prison and bring him before Pharaoh. This is Joseph. He gives Pharaoh a killer dream interpretation. All the officials around him are looking at him sideways, thinking, who the hell is this guy? And this pug just got out of jail. But Joseph doesn't give a damn and nails the interpretation. The interpretation was so good. Pharaoh's blown away and goes, Joseph, I like you. Stay by my side and keep interpreting my dreams. You're awesome. And just like that, he makes Joseph, who was dragged to Egypt as a slave, the prime minister of Egypt. This is what I call the Joseph hustle. A slave becomes the prime minister of Egypt overnight just by being good at interpreting dreams. This painting shows Joseph's funeral, and since he died as the prime minister of Egypt, his funeral was done in the Egyptian style. Anyway, now that Joseph was the PM, what do you think happened? Before, Jews were treated like garbage in Egypt. Why? Because Egypt was a polytheistic society, run on the logic of Pharaoh equals God. They couldn't stand the Jews who insisted on worshiping only one God, Yahweh. The vibe was, how dare you worship only one God, not in Egypt? But now, with Joseph, a Jew, as the prime minister, the treatment of the Jewish people naturally had to get a whole lot better.
But the Jewish people were having a lot of babies. The Bible says the Hebrew women were super fertile and having kids left and right. So who were the Hebrews? The term comes from the idea of one who crossed over the river Euphrates, like Abraham. It was basically another name for the Jewish people at the time. What does it mean when a specific ethnic group starts multiplying like that? I've mentioned this before. The Chinese government hates it when a minority population grows too large. Why? Because if their numbers grow, they might start rebelling, demanding independence, and become a revolutionary force. That's why they crack down so hard on places like Xinjiang and Tibet. It was the same in Egypt. A growing Jewish population was seen as a potential revolutionary force. We can't let this happen. We can't let the Jews keep having so many kids. So, Pharaoh gives an order. Every baby boy born to a Hebrew family must be thrown into the Nile River to die. Horrifying, right? And if you didn't throw your son in the Nile, Pharaoh said your entire family for 3 generations would be executed. So as heartbreaking as it was, they had no choice. There were so many Jewish mothers grieving as they threw their own children into the river. But then, a baby boy was born to one particular Jewish family. They were supposed to throw him in the Nile, but they couldn't bear it. So, they placed the baby in a basket made of reeds and set it afloat on the river. They weren't just abandoning him. They were hoping that as the basket floated down the river past different villages, someone might find him and raise him, that he might just survive. And right on cue, this baby gets the ultimate main character buff. While countless other baby boys were dying in the Nile, this specific baby's basket is found by Pharaoh's daughter, the princess of Egypt. She thinks, my father ordered all the Hebrew baby boys to be killed. This must be one of those poor babies floating down the river. She goes to her father and says, Dad, I want to raise him. He's not a Hebrew, okay?
Deal?
Yeah, deal. So, the Egyptian princess gets her father's permission, takes the baby, and raises him. And this baby, the one with the insane main character plot armor, who is he? He's Moses. That's who. All right, so this guy right here is Moses. This is him as a kid, and this is middle-aged Moses. Hey, I was cute when I was young too, guys. Anyway, the problem is Moses is a Jew. Back then, what did Pharaoh declare in Egypt? He wanted all the baby boys thrown into the Nile River. But Moses was a Jew, right? So Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, finds him, brings him home, and basically lies to her dad, raising him as if he weren't a Jew. But Moses himself knew he was Jewish. He knew, but if he went around announcing it, his life would be in danger. So he kept his mouth shut and quietly grew up as the son of the princess. At the time in Egypt, the Jewish people were basically treated like slaves. They were dragged off to forced labor, hauling a ridiculous amount of bricks. You've seen those old pictures, right? The ones of people getting whipped while building the pyramids. The Egyptians were working the Jews to the bone. And one day, Moses witnesses his fellow Jews getting whipped and going through hell. I mean, he's a prince, right? As the son of the princess, he's living a pretty lavish life. Riding premium camels and horses, wearing fancy, glittering gold clothes, the loincloth-looking things. But the other Jews are dressed in rags, working their asses off. He sees this, and he already knows he's a Jew. He knows he's Jewish, and they're Jewish, and he sees them getting whipped and suffering. He should have just held it in. He really should have. But our boy Moses, our hot-headed, righteous Moses, just couldn't take it. He sees the Egyptian overseer whipping them and just knocks the guy out cold. The second he messed the guy up, it was instant chaos. "We have to catch that bastard Moses! That son of a bitch was a Jew all along!" Everyone from the pharaoh to the princess's household went into a frenzy. The princess got chewed out by her dad, like, how could you raise someone like that? And all of Egypt was in an uproar, shouting, "We gotta catch that guy Moses!" So, obviously, Moses makes a run for it. To where? Right here, modern-day Israel. And he made a clean getaway. He got away, and he even got married. He was living a good life after getting married. But then he starts hearing a voice. It's like a broadcast saying, "Moses, how could you just leave by yourself? Your fellow Jews are all going through hell. You need to go back right now and bring them out." It was an order from God. So Moses hears God's order and heads back to Egypt. He has to go meet Pharaoh because God gave him the order. He tells Pharaoh exactly what God told him to say. "Hey, stop using God's people as slaves for your labor. Release our Jewish people, the chosen people of God, the ones who will be saved right now." And of course, Pharaoh's response is basically, "Yeah, get lost. Some random guy with no army, no nothing, just shows up and tells me to free them? Who's going to agree to that?" So Moses tells him again, "Oh, you won't let them go? Fine. God's going to use his 10 cheat codes to totally wreck you. Before God unleashes 10 plagues on you, you better free my people." That's what he says. And what do you think Pharaoh said this time? Yeah, screw off. Pharaoh just blows him off again. And right after that, God's 10 cheat codes, the 10 plagues of God, actually start to happen. The Nile River turns to blood. Frogs are absolutely everywhere. Bullfrogs croaking like crazy. Swarms of locusts eat all the crops. Darkness covers Egypt for 3 whole days. And it's written in the Bible that all the firstborn sons in every family started to die. So after getting hit with this 10 plague combo, Pharaoh's like, my bad, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize, I surrender, I'm sorry." And with that, Moses starts leading the entire Jewish population out of there, toward the place that God had told them about. But as they're leaving, it turns out this guy's petty as hell. Pharaoh says he's sorry and tells them to go, but later on he thinks about it and gets pissed. He's like,
Why the hell should I let them go? What have those bastards ever done for me? He gets super angry, can't let it go, and starts chasing after them. Moses and the Jews were making a good escape. They were running well, but now the Egyptians are chasing them like crazy. They're thinking, oh, we're so screwed. They're running for their lives, and what's in front of them? The Red Sea. And this, my friends, is the famous miracle of Moses. This is where Moses prays to God, the Red Sea splits wide open, and the miracle of Moses happens, allowing all the Jewish people to escape. And with the most insane timing, just as the last of the Jews cross, the waters crash back together, and all the Egyptian soldiers are swept away and die. That story is the famous miracle of Moses.
With the miracle of Moses, the masses of Jewish people and Moses cross the Red Sea. All of them make it across. But then Moses leads the Jews to wander in the desert for 40 years. What does this mean? If you look at the Sinai Peninsula here, it's basically a wasteland. Almost no grass grows here. It's a desert, and it's incredibly hard for people to survive here. But the Bible records that Moses led the Jews and wandered through this very place for 40 long years. This is where the faith of the Jewish people is forged. What are the 40 years in the wilderness? What do you think? It's pure, hellish suffering. The idea is that all this suffering, wandering for 40 years, is God's will. It's like this. The reason we're going through all this crap is because we are the only people in the world who will be saved. So God is giving us, the Jewish people, these extra hardships and trials. But despite it all, you will be saved later and go to heaven when you die. So you have to endure this suffering. There is a deep, profound meaning from God in all of this. That's how they think. So because of this, all the things the Jewish people have gone through, even up to Hitler's Holocaust, they see all of it as God's will. All this hardship and persecution is happening because God specifically chose us. And from this, the chosen people ideology develops. It's like, you guys didn't get picked by God, right? Well, we did. You're state school. I'm Ivy League. You know that kind of vibe? Like, I'm on a whole different level from you. I'm a bit more special. They kind of have that chosen people superiority complex. Anyway, Moses parts the Red Sea, performs his miracle, wanders the desert for 40 years, goes through hell, and then, anyone who goes to church has heard this a million times from their pastor, they head for the land of milk and honey, Canaan. This is the region of Palestine where Israel is today, the land God chose for the Jewish people. They race towards it, and as they go, what happens? They establish a nation. What did they establish? The ancient kingdom of Israel. You all know it, right? The kingdom that lasted for just 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, before it totally collapsed. If you look at the dates, it only lasts from 1048 BC to 930 BC. Anyway, so the ancient kingdom of Israel is established. But the moment Solomon dies, they immediately start fighting each other, trying to seize the throne. As they fight, the kingdom splits into North Israel and South Judah. Then the north gets wiped out by Assyria, and the south gets devoured by Babylon. After this, the Jewish people had no national state of their own, basically not until 1945. After the kingdom of Israel fell, the Jews were scattered beyond the Middle East and Arab regions to places like Egypt and Libya, where they were dragged off as slaves, broken, and executed. That's the life they lived. But despite all that, they held on to the belief that they must only worship the one God, Yahweh. They'd go to another country, and even if that country had a state religion, they'd refuse to follow it, insisting, even as they were dragged away, we must only worship the one God, Yahweh. This just led to them being constantly persecuted. Then a massive empire takes over this whole Middle Eastern and Arab region. What rises? The Roman Empire. The interesting thing about Rome is that it was originally a republic, a democracy. The citizens voted to make laws, hold trials, and decide on national matters. They even had a senate like a congress. It was a very unique system, way ahead of its time. Up until the time of Julius Caesar, there was no emperor in Rome. He was a consul, which is kind of like the prime minister of Japan if you want an analogy. So, up until Caesar, Rome was a republic.
But Julius Caesar had an adopted son. And who was that? Augustus. That's who? A very famous guy, right? This guy, following in his father's footsteps as consul, completely wrecks the successful republic. He declares, from now on, Rome has an emperor. He just torpedoes the whole republican system that had been working so well. Then he starts pulling this line. The emperor is God. Therefore, I am God. God is Augustus. He starts playing the God card. Why on earth would he suddenly pull a ridiculous stunt like that? I mean, as emperor, he's already the absolute ruler, so he could just live the good life. Why go through the trouble of pulling this "the emperor is God" crap? Think about it. Let's say the harvest completely fails one year. What happens? The people go nuts, shouting, "What has this country ever done for us? These bastards just take our taxes." But what if the masses truly believe the emperor is a god? What happens then? They'd say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. We didn't perform the proper rituals or worship you correctly last year, so you have punished us." That's what they do. If the emperor becomes God, you can't dare to oppose him, not once it becomes like a religion. That's the goal. At the time, it wasn't just the Roman Empire. Egypt did it too. There were a lot of rulers who tried to use the ruler is God method to play politics. It makes governing easy. Whether the country goes to hell, falls apart, or people starve to death, you can just say, whatever. It's because you all didn't worship me properly. Don't blame me. And then you can just rule without a care in the world. So there was a reason for all that "the emperor is God" nonsense. In short, the masses of people in the Roman Empire were forced to believe that the Roman emperor was a god. But like I said before, what about the Jews who believed they must only worship the one God Yahweh, and who already had a long history of trouble in other countries because of their religion? They start to clash, big time. From the Roman Empire's perspective, it was like, what the hell do we do with these damn Jews? Why are they so defiant? If they just gave up their religion and worshiped the emperor as God-fearing Roman citizens, they could live peacefully. But the Jews stubbornly kept shouting, "There is only one God Yahweh. A trashy cult that worships an emperor as God is wrong." So the Roman Empire ordered them to worship the emperor as a god, and there was frequent trouble with the Jews. But while there were these noisy conflicts in the Roman Empire, an era began where things were relatively stable and Rome was somewhat tolerant of the Jewish religion. Until suddenly this person appears. Who? Jesus Christ. So, this figure named Jesus shows up and basically says, Judaism is a lost cause. Those Jews are a bunch of clueless idiots who can't even recognize the Messiah sent by God. A bunch of morons who don't even know their own king. Right. So that more or less brings us to the end of the Old Testament, and with the birth of Jesus, the New Testament begins. So right, this is how Christianity begins, springing out of the religion of Judaism with the arrival of Jesus. So Judaism is mostly the Old Testament, but when you add the New Testament to the Old Testament, that's when the religion of Christianity starts, with the birth of Jesus as the key turning point. And as you can imagine, right away, the Jewish people were already getting their asses kicked by the Roman Empire, just getting racked and brutally oppressed, barely hanging on. And now this new religion, Christianity, shows up to give them even more grief. From the perspective of the Jews, it was seriously pissing them off. So they immediately started saying, that guy, that Jesus guy, his religion is a cult. Why? Because Christianity was built by taking the Jewish Old Testament and adding his own teachings on top of it. From the Jewish point of view, they had no choice but to see him as a cult leader back then. So, in the eyes of the Jewish people, Jesus was someone who needed to be eliminated quickly, a cult leader. And so the Jews go to that famous figure, Pontius Pilate. They go to him and say, you need to kill that man Jesus. He's a fraud. But their inner thoughts were probably something like this. Our religion, Judaism, is already struggling, and now with Jesus around, the future of Judaism itself is on the verge of collapse. You know why? Because people who used to be Jewish were switching sides. More and more people were converting from Judaism, choosing to follow Jesus and believe in Christianity. From the perspective of the Jewish priests and religious leaders, the situation was just unbelievable. At the time, Pontius Pilate was the governor around Jerusalem. The Jews go to this guy and basically scream, "You have to kill that Jesus guy. He's a fraud, a damn cult leader. Why aren't you killing him? You have to kill him now." And from Pilate's perspective, this was just absurd. They just show up out of nowhere demanding an execution. Pilate's thinking, look, it doesn't seem like this Jesus fellow has killed anyone. Does he really need to be executed? Do we really have to go that far? So the Jews say, if you don't, we will rebel. They threaten Pontius Pilate, telling him they'll start an uprising if he doesn't execute Jesus. Now, to understand how ridiculous this was at the time, you have to realize that for a power like the Roman Empire, a little uprising by the local Jews was absolutely nothing. The population difference was on a whole different level. The military power was on a whole different level. It was a joke. A threat of rebellion from the Jews should have been laughable. But Pontius Pilate freaks out at this threat and decides to execute Jesus. So why did he do it? Pontius Pilate was a bureaucrat. You can't forget this, people. Never forget this. It's like any regional manager or director will tell you, when you're in charge of your branch, the number one rule is that nothing bad happens on your watch. It's the same principle. As long as Pontius Pilate was governor, he just needed things to be quiet. So, unable to withstand the threats from the Jews, Pontius Pilate executes Jesus. But as he does, he puts a sign above him that reads, "The King of the Jews." Why would he write that? From the Roman Empire's perspective, the Jews were a thorn in their side. They were a group that constantly caused headaches for Rome. So what does it mean if the Jews actually have a king, Jesus? It means they are a potential revolutionary force. It was a political calculation to lump the Jews and Jesus as Christians together and say, see, they're all a potential coup faction. These people could start a civil war at any moment. That's what historians suspect was the political reason for putting the King of the Jews on the sign. See, there's a reason for everything. It's not just random killing. When people take action, if we only look at it from one side, it seems like a reckless execution. But if you look at it from the perspective of politicians in the state, there are different reasons. Rome, as an empire, had its own interests. The emperor's power was paramount. They were trying to build this whole "the emperor is a god" narrative, but the Jews weren't buying it. Then Jesus shows up trying to start Christianity. Taking all of that into account, you can see it as a PR move to brand both Jesus and the Jews as a revolutionary force. Anyway, through this process, Jesus gets executed. But here's the twist. You'd think the problem for Rome would be over with Jesus gone, but instead, the Jews launch a massive rebellion against the Roman Empire. There were a couple of these, known as the Roman Jewish Wars. What were they about? Well, since the Roman Empire was pushing this bullshit about the emperor being a god, they obviously treated the Jews like crap, right? As this continued, a deeply prejudiced atmosphere formed against the Jewish people. For example, if a Roman citizen was murdered, the cops would be all over it, like, who is the bastard that did this, and investigate like crazy. But if a Jew was murdered, the Roman police and soldiers wouldn't even bat an eye. So what? Who cares? It's a hassle. This kind of stuff piled up until the Jews couldn't take it anymore and exploded. And that explosion, my friends, were the First and Second Roman Jewish Wars.
This was around 60 AD, about 30 years after Jesus was executed. And the emperor, when this war broke out, was none other than Nero. Emperor Nero says, all right, that's it with the Jews. They refuse to accept the emperor as a god, and they just start rebellions. This is unacceptable. Just round them all up and crush them. They're too much trouble. Get them all. So, Jews from all over the Roman Empire flee to the city of Jerusalem. It was their ultimate fortress. They all holed up in there and put up a hell of a fight, but Emperor Nero obviously ordered his army to go and completely demolish Jerusalem. So the Roman legions start tearing the city down. They start destroying the city walls themselves to make sure the Jews couldn't act up again. But the general in charge of tearing down the city, a guy named Titus, suddenly says, whoa, guys, stop. Just tear down a part of the wall. Don't destroy all of it. Why? He said, we need to leave behind a trace of the fact that we, the Roman Empire, wrecked this supposedly impenetrable fortress of Jerusalem. He left it partially destroyed as a monument. If you destroy everything, there's no proof. You gotta have something to brag about to future generations. So he only half destroyed it. And that partially destroyed wall is the Wailing Wall. Get it? And here's a fun fact. Titus, the guy who ordered them to leave the wall standing, later becomes emperor. After crushing the rebellion, he becomes the Roman emperor. And as soon as he's emperor, he drags 100,000 Jews into forced labor. And what did they build? You guessed it, the Colosseum. Okay, so anyway, they'd finally crushed the noisy Jews, so you'd think the Roman Empire would finally get some peace and quiet, right? They thought, now our great Roman Empire can just cruise along and prosper. But then Christianity starts to take off. You shut down Judaism, and now Christianity starts making noise. Before it was the Jews saying, why is the emperor a god? The one true God is Jehovah. Now it's the Christians saying, why is the emperor a god? Jesus Christ is the Messiah. From Rome's perspective, every time things started going well, something would blow up here, something would blow up there. Rome at that time was a total shit show. On top of that, there was the crisis of the 3rd century, where generals were staging coups left and right, and Rome actually split into 3 pieces. The country was a mess, and now you had Christians causing trouble everywhere, so things were getting more and more exhausting. To sort this out, Rome does manage to reunite, but their conclusion for why everything was such a mess was, our territory is too big and we're mismanaging it. So what they came up with was the Tetrarchy system, 4 emperors. They split the Roman territory in half with an emperor and a junior emperor in the west and an emperor and a junior emperor in the east. The 4 of them were supposed to rule it together. How long do you think that lasted? Yeah, right? It devolved into, I'm the emperor of this whole damn thing, you son of a bitch, why are you taking the east? And they started fighting like hell again. It barely lasted 20 years. Human greed for power. That's no joke, right? But where did Christianity first get popular? The Middle East, modern-day Israel, right? So obviously, when you split the Roman Empire down the middle, there were way more Christians in the East. But the emperor in the West wanted to crush the East and rule the whole thing himself. He starts playing 4D chess. He thinks, there are a lot of Christians in the East. If I pretend to love Christianity, I might be able to take over the East. And this Western emperor's little scheme actually works, and he takes over the entire Roman Empire. And who was that Western emperor? The one and only, the famous Constantine. In 313, with the Edict of Milan, he officially recognizes Christianity. What does that mean? It means, hey, you Christian bros, love me. It was a totally obvious ploy to win over the people and wield absolute power by declaring, I'm a Christian too. That's politicians for you. Politics needs religion. That's the key takeaway here. Later, Emperor Theodosius goes even further and makes Christianity the state religion. And then he says, everyone, you all remember how the Jews tried to kill our Lord Jesus, right? The social evil in this Christian nation is the Jews. He turned the Jews into the public enemy to divert all the Christians' attention onto them. The Romans killed him. Pontius Pilate executed him, but they completely erased their own responsibility.
They were worried that if the truth the Roman Empire actually killed Jesus ever got out, the Christians would rise up against them. To prevent that, they pinned it all on the Jews to win the favor of the Christians. It's all like the prep work for colonial rule. It's the same as when Britain and France sent missionaries to Asia first. If the Western religion spreads, people develop favorable feelings toward the Western country, which makes it easier to backstab them and suck them dry later. Why do you think the Japanese forced Koreans to change their names during the occupation? Because it makes political manipulation easier. Christianity started to spread like wildfire across Rome because it was a useful tool for politicians to use for their power grabs and schemes. But this raises a question. What exactly is Christianity? Roman Catholicism, the Church of England, Protestantism, the Russian Orthodox Church, all of these religions that believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah are called Christianity. Sometimes Protestants think we are the only Christians, but that's not the case. So what are modern-day Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism, and where, why, and how did they split apart? To figure that out, we first need to get to know Peter. You have to understand the figure of Peter, and then all of this will be explained.
Even today, if you go to Israel, you'll find a really beautiful place called the Sea of Galilee. Back in the day, there was a fisherman who used to catch fish in that very lake to feed his family. His name was Simon. Just an ordinary guy from the neighborhood, Simon. This guy, Simon, launched his boat on the lake bright and early that day, dreaming of a huge catch. But man, for some reason, maybe his bait was bad, or maybe the fish all took a vacation, he just couldn't get a single bite, no matter how many times he cast his line. It was seriously the worst fishing trip ever. He was probably thinking, ugh, today's a bust. How am I going to face my wife? He was just about to throw in the towel. And then, just at that moment, someone suddenly shows up. Who? None other than Jesus. He just hops right onto Simon's boat. Then he casually tells a tired Simon, "Hey Simon, not there. Try throwing your net out over there, in the deep part." No, not there. At first, Simon was probably thinking, what's up with this guy? He hadn't caught a single fish all day, and this dude was telling him amateur stuff. But as if he were hypnotized, Simon threw the net exactly where Jesus told him to. And, oh my God, so many fish came up that the net was practically tearing. It was like a deep-sea fishing trawler pulling in a massive tuna school. Fish were just going crazy. They even had to call over a neighboring boat to help them haul it all in because their own boat was almost tipping over. Simon didn't just think, "Wow, jackpot!" when he saw this. He got goosebumps all over, instinctively realizing this person is no ordinary man. So he just fell to his knees before Jesus. It was then that Jesus said something really important to this fisherman. "Hey, Simon the fisherman, stop catching fish. From now on, you're going to be a fisher of men. And change your name too. Go file for a name change at the courthouse." And that's when Simon received a new name. What was it? Peter. Peter means rock. So it was like Jesus bestowed this name on him with the feeling of, from now on, you will be the unshakable rock of this church, a steadfast foundation.
So that's Peter for you, a fisherman who met Jesus, had his life turned around, and became his main disciple. But as you know, the tragic event of Jesus being crucified happened. Ironically, though, after Jesus' execution, Christianity, which believed in Jesus as the Messiah, began to spread tremendously throughout the Roman Empire. But what was the Roman Empire saying back then? The emperor is a god, bow down to the emperor, right? So naturally, Christianity, which declared there is only one God and that's the Lord, was a thorn in their side. The more Christianity spread, the more severe the persecution became. Christians were arrested, executed, and heavily oppressed.
But what's fascinating is that the more they were persecuted, the angrier Christians became, and the more they united. They thought, go ahead, kill us. We're going to heaven. With that mindset, they preached even more fervently and worshiped with greater passion, and their faith grew even stronger. So, where was the center of early Christianity? Where was Jesus executed? That's right, Jerusalem. So, after Jesus' execution, what was the center of Christianity? Jerusalem, of course. And after Jesus passed away, who was the spiritual pillar and leader for the remaining Christians? Naturally, it was Jesus' top disciple, Peter. He was considered the eldest among Jesus' 12 disciples and was respected by everyone, so Peter naturally took on the role of leader for the early church. But then, Peter made a huge decision. He decided to cross beyond Jerusalem and the region of Israel through what is now Turkey, all the way to the heart of the empire, Rome. Why? To spread the gospel. It was to fulfill Jesus' final command in the Bible, go to the ends of the earth and preach my gospel. Nowadays, you might just think, oh, he went to Rome and you can get there in a flash by plane. But around 50 AD, traveling from Jerusalem to Rome wasn't just a trip. It was a journey risking your life. You could encounter pirates, starve to death, or die from illness. It was a truly perilous road. But at this point, we shouldn't just think, oh, Peter went far away to preach. How amazing. The truly important point, one you absolutely can't forget, is that he went when Christian persecution was at its peak, not long after Jesus had been crucified. You must not forget that. What was the situation for Christians back then? They were being brutally suppressed. The Roman Empire would capture Christians and simply decapitate them, throw them to wild animals in the Colosseum, burn them alive. They committed all sorts of unspeakably cruel acts. And Peter went right into the heart of that persecution, into Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. That's practically like saying, please, just kill me. He was literally putting his life on the line. And wouldn't you know it, right there in Rome, where he had just put his life on the line, and just as Peter was about to start preaching, a colossal event exploded. What happened? The Great Fire of Rome broke out.
This fire was so massive that almost 2/3 of Rome was reportedly burned down. The entire city became an inferno. Countless people died or lost their homes. It was a truly devastating catastrophe. Back then, there was no fire insurance, no fire trucks. They were completely helpless. The Roman emperor at the time was the infamous Emperor Nero. This guy, Nero, immediately scrambled to put out the fire, handed out food to the victims, and tried to calm the public. Citizens, calm down. The fire has been extinguished. Don't worry. So, what was Nero aiming for? The Roman emperor constantly spread propaganda that he was a god, right? You remember that. So, Nero's scenario was this. I, Emperor Nero, a divine being, solved this great disaster. Our emperor truly is a god. He wanted things to go that way, for his popularity to skyrocket. He expected the people to praise him, saying, "Wow, God extinguished the fire!" That was the picture he envisioned. But what was the reality? As soon as the fire was put out, the people's anger exploded. "What has the government done for us, you idiot? What did that Nero do as emperor? He caused a fire that burned down my home, my fields, that disrespectful jerk." Instead, there was a massive backlash and chaos. And it wasn't helping that Nero, instead of doing his emperor duties, thought he was some kind of artist. He'd write poems and sing songs, thinking, "Oh, I'm Rome's idol." So there was no way public sentiment would be good. There were even rumors that Nero recited poetry while watching Rome burn. With public sentiment at an all-time low, Christians started to speak up again.
Look, how can that man Nero be a god? There is only one true God in heaven. God punished you because you worshipped idols and became corrupt. Repent and believe in Jesus Christ. They were preaching like this, and in all that chaos, Christianity started to slowly spread even further. So, what did Nero feel about all this? His public approval was in shambles because of him. His political standing was shaky. He was in a nightmare situation. And Christians were using this chaos to gain power. He needed a way to break through this predicament. So Nero came up with a really vile and cruel idea. He decided to create a scapegoat. This terrible great fire that turned Rome into an inferno. It's all because of those Christians. Those devils, holding a grudge because their religion was suppressed, set fire to our great Rome. We must punish those wicked people. That's how he played the media. And it actually worked. You see Nero in this picture? He looks so grumpy, doesn't he? Just from his appearance, he could at least dress properly.
Riding on this wave of public opinion, Nero began a massive slaughter of Christians. He used especially cruel methods, crucifying them, dousing their bodies in oil, and setting them on fire to create human torches. There are even records saying he used them as lighting for his garden at night. He really drove the point home, saying, "These wretches who caused the great fire of Rome deserve to be burned alive like this." This cruel media manipulation succeeded, and all of the Roman citizens' anger turned towards the Christians. "Oh, those cult members made me lose everything." Public opinion completely flipped, and at this time, Peter, who was preaching in Rome, was eventually arrested and executed. There's a famous anecdote about Peter's execution. "I dare not die in the same way as my teacher Jesus. Hang me upside down on the cross." And so, he was truly crucified upside down and martyred. Even though Christianity's image in the Roman Empire was utterly shattered like this, the religion's vitality didn't die out. It continued to grow its influence. Its roots just grew deeper. As Christians endured persecution and their numbers grew within the Roman Empire, a new system became necessary. They needed to establish branches. All right, let me give you an analogy. Imagine I opened a burger joint and it just blew up. Customers were lining up around the block. It was crazy. So what do you do then? You open a second location, a third, maybe even franchises. You gotta start a franchise business to make more money, right? Christianity was the same. Its influence grew so immensely that they couldn't manage everything from just Jerusalem anymore. So they decided, let's open up some branches. We'll establish offices in 5 important strategic cities to manage everything efficiently. Originally, there was a position called bishop who led the church in each region. But among them, 5 major city churches with particularly strong influence emerged as the central hubs, the major league franchises, if you will. Those 5 regions were Rome, Constantinople, Istanbul, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. These cities were densely populated and served as centers of commerce and culture in the Roman Empire at the time, so they naturally grew into central hubs for Christianity as well. The bishops of these 5 major regions gained a far greater influence and respect than bishops from other areas. So, with these 5 major league churches firmly established, that's when the power struggles slowly began. It was all about who was at the top of the food chain. But there was a problem. Where did Peter die, do you remember? It was in Rome, right? Jesus' top disciple, the rock of the church, Peter, had preached and was martyred in Rome. The Bishop of Rome wasn't just going to let that slide. One day, the Bishop of Rome suddenly started making these bold claims. Hey, honestly, aren't we among the 5 major bishops on a different level? Isn't our Roman Church the absolute foundation? Why? Because St. Peter, Jesus' chief disciple, personally founded it and was even martyred right here in Rome. As his successor, I am the top dog among the bishops of these 5 regions.
The person who first formalized this claim was Stephen I, the 23rd Bishop of Rome. This guy just flat out said, the other 4 regions combined don't even come close. I, who inherited the position of the Bishop of Rome, where St. Peter died, am the best. How do you think the bishops of the other 4 regions reacted to this? They were dumbfounded. They were thinking, seriously, what's gotten into this guy? We're all supposed to be equal, leading our followers according to God's word. Why is he suddenly acting like he's superior and drawing lines? The atmosphere got really tense. But surprisingly, this I'm the best claim that the Bishop of Rome was making all by himself actually started to gain tremendous support over time. How did something he was just boasting about on his own actually gain recognition from others, everyone? Why do you think that happened? There was a very practical reason for this. Back during times of severe Christian persecution, like under Emperor Nero, when their lives were at stake, some people would abandon their faith and flee, right? People who were so scared of being caught and burned at the stake that they stopped coming to church and went into hiding. After the persecution ended, a debate broke out over how to deal with these people. The bishops of the other 4 regions were super strict, old school, rigid types. They said, how dare they betray the Lord just because they're afraid of persecution? They ran away because they were scared of dying? We can never forgive such traitors. We must hold a religious trial and severely punish them. That's how they reacted. But at this time, only the Bishop of Rome took a very cool stance. Hey guys, come on, let's give them a break. How scary must it have been when their lives were on the line? It's understandable if they ran away and stopped coming to church. We shouldn't drag them back and punish them. Let's forgive and embrace everyone. That's what he said. So if you were a Christian who briefly fled because you feared for your life, who would you support? The Bishop of Rome, of course. Phew. Our Roman bishop is the best. His heart is as vast as the Pacific Ocean. He's on a whole different level than those strict old-timers. The Roman bishop is truly the top dog in Christianity. And like that, countless fearful apostates became fans of the Bishop of Rome, and his actual popularity began to skyrocket. Through this process, the number of Christians within the Roman Empire steadily increased, and naturally, the standing of the Bishop of Rome rose along with it. Eventually, the influence of all 5 major diocese bishops grew, but the power of the Bishop of Rome was particularly exceptional. Then, a decisive blow landed. It was the appearance of Emperor Constantine the Great. In 313 AD, this guy issued the Edict of Milan, ending that terrible Christian persecution and outright declaring religious freedom. He even converted to Christianity himself later on. Think about it. The capital of the Roman Empire was Rome. The bishop of the capital, the Bishop of Rome, was already super popular. And now, even the emperor of the empire officially recognized Christianity and strongly supported it. Wow, that's like getting wings. The authority and popularity of the Bishop of Rome truly soared through the roof. So the Bishop of Rome was just about to stamp his authority and declare, I am, without a doubt, the church's supreme leader. But then, as the saying goes, there's a silver lining to every cloud. Right after Constantine unified the Roman Empire and officially recognized Christianity, he made a shocking announcement. He was going to move the capital. Where to? Istanbul! From the Bishop of Rome's perspective, what happened next was a total nightmare. The capital of the empire suddenly moved from good old Rome to Istanbul, or, as it was called back then, Constantinople. It was a brand new, planned administrative capital. To give you an analogy, it's kind of like if the capital of the United States suddenly moved from a major existing city like New York or Philadelphia to a freshly built Washington, D.C. And just like that, the Bishop of Rome was basically left high and dry. I mean, things were going great for him. He was well on his way to becoming the center of Christianity, the most popular, top dog bishop out there. But then, Emperor Constantine suddenly decides to move the capital to Istanbul. It completely rained on his parade.
Now, this didn't mean the Bishop of Rome's position or the 5 major patriarchates, the main branches, just disappeared. The Bishop of Rome was still around, but right when his influence should have been expanding, moving the capital to Istanbul put the brakes on his momentum. His stock was soaring, and then it just tanked. You know what I mean, right? Like a graph that's shooting up and then suddenly takes a nosedive. After this, under Emperor Constantine, Christianity was officially recognized, and later, under Emperor Theodosius, it became the state religion of the Roman Empire. Okay, you really need to listen up now. Pay close attention. You absolutely cannot forget this next part. I want you to erase every word you have in your head right now. Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, whatever kind of Christianity you're thinking of, get rid of it. Forget Presbyterian, Methodist, all of it. I want you to imagine pulling out all the synapses in your brain. You need to listen with a completely blank slate.
So, what was Christianity like back in this era? There were no denominations. It was basically the OG version. At that time, there was just one Christianity. That's it. Got it? Okay, listen carefully here. There was only one form of Christianity, no sects. But then the word Catholic appears. It's a word that means universal, all-encompassing, general. They basically rebranded Christianity with this name, Catholic. The idea was that Christianity had now become the default, the universal religion. I mean, at that point, Christianity had become the state religion of the Roman Empire, so it was universal and standard, right? So they started calling Christianity Catholic. Now, do not picture the Pope here. Don't think of anyone like Pope Francis. Empty your mind and just listen. You'll understand later why I'm being so insistent about this. So, what were the bishops in the 5 major regions at the time? They were Catholic bishops. Why? Because Christianity simply changed its name to Catholic. All 5 of these guys were Catholic bishops. Don't say things like Catholic means the Roman Catholic Church. Don't say anything and forget the Pope. Erase it all, clear your mind, and just listen. All you need to remember is this: Christianity's name changed to Catholic. So what happened then? What's the Bishop of Rome's position now? The same guy who was running his mouth about being the top dog of Christianity? Now he's just saying, I'm the top dog of Catholicism. It's the exact same claim. Since Christianity's name changed to Catholic, it means the very same thing. The claim to be the top dog bishop of Christianity just became the claim to be the top dog of Catholicism. All 5 of these guys are equal Catholic bishops. Only the name of the religion changed. But what happens to the Roman Empire later? It splits into the Western and Eastern Roman empires. The sons fought each other and divided it. But the Eastern Empire was already using Constantinople as its capital. And the Eastern Roman Empire had a lot of money at the time. Its foundation was pretty solid. 4 of the 5 main branches of Christianity were located in the Eastern Empire. So what does that mean? It means more Christians were there, more money was there, and the state's foundation and economic power were all concentrated in the East. But the Western Roman Empire doesn't last long and collapses. The Germanic tribes to the north get their butts kicked by the Huns and come pouring down south, completely wrecking the Western Roman Empire. The details aren't important, but what happened to our Bishop of Rome over there? He was once again left high and dry. This was no time for him to be shouting, I'm the top dog. Everything was being destroyed by the Germanic tribes. He was in no position to do that. Of course, the Germanic tribes crushing the West wasn't just bad news for the Bishop of Rome. If they could destroy the West, it meant they could destroy the East too. So the fall of the West was a pretty nerve-wracking situation for the Eastern Empire as well. But on the other hand, for the Eastern Roman Emperor, it was a golden opportunity.
Let me explain. The Bishop of Rome over in the West was constantly getting too big for his britches. From the Eastern Emperor's point of view, this guy in Rome was getting annoying. the majority of his citizens were already Christian, and it was getting to a point where they might stop listening to the emperor and only listen to the Bishop of Rome. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome could just tell the masses, "My dear flock, you should listen to me more than the emperor, right?" That was a real possibility. So, naturally, the emperor wanted to put him in his place. The emperor wanted to crush the Bishop of Rome, and conveniently, the Germanic tribes came down and crushed the Western Empire for him. So, jackpot. Of course, the Germanic tribes were also eyeing the Eastern Empire, but still, this was a sweet deal. He must have thought, this is my chance. To take down the Bishop of Rome, who had become a thorn in his side among the 5 Christian patriarchs, the Eastern Emperor teamed up with the Archbishop of Istanbul, that is, Constantinople. He made the Archbishop of Constantinople the ecumenical patriarch of the whole Catholic world. He declared, "The Archbishop of Constantinople is now the head of all Christianity, the ecumenical patriarch. That guy in Rome, he's just a regular bishop. The supreme leader of the entire Catholic, i.e. Christian world, is the Archbishop of Constantinople." Why? To completely crush the Bishop of Rome's spirit. It was like he was thinking, this guy keeps popping up like a weed no matter how many times I step on him. I'm going to stomp him out for good this time. That was the emperor's move to break the Bishop of Rome's momentum. Since Christianity was now called Catholic, the new line was, "The title of ecumenical patriarch of the Catholic world now belongs to the Patriarch of Constantinople. That makes the Bishop of Rome just an archbishop. Not this, not that, just a plain old archbishop. Sure, he has some status, but the Archbishop of Constantinople is way more powerful. The ultimate elder of all Christianity worldwide is in Constantinople." That's the narrative the Eastern Roman Emperor and the Archbishop of Constantinople cooked up together. Immediately, the Bishop of Rome threw a fit, shouting, "That's bullshit! Why are you the top dog? I'm the top dog!" and fought like hell. But regardless of his protests, the Western Roman Empire had already collapsed. It had been wrecked by the Germanic tribes, so it didn't matter how much of a scene the Bishop of Rome made. He had no one to back him up, his country was gone, and he was effectively boxed in by the foreign Germanic peoples. It's not like the Germanic tribes were about to start singing his praises. So, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish on its own while the West remained in ruins. The history of the Roman Empire continued on this path. It seemed like the Bishop of Rome's story was over, and only the Eastern Empire would continue to prosper. But then, Muhammad was born.
And Muhammad threw another bucket of cold water on everything. Just when things were going well for the East, the Islamic Empire, starting with Muhammad, began to expand and ended up conquering a huge chunk of the Eastern Roman Empire's territory. 3 of those major Christian centers in the East that I mentioned earlier were all swallowed up by the Umayyad Caliphate. In other words, Islam's influence expanded massively, and what happened to Christian influence? Only 2 centers were left, Rome and Constantinople. That's it. From the Eastern Empire's perspective, the situation was now, damn it, I was just about to sideline the Bishop of Rome, team up with the other 4 bishops, rally the Christians, and solidify my imperial authority, and now those exact regions have been conquered. Meanwhile, back in the territory of the former Western Roman Empire, which had been overrun by Germanic tribes, a very powerful kingdom eventually rises. The Frankish Kingdom, a strong kingdom established by the Germanic peoples. But there was one problem. What was it? The kingdom was established, but the people wouldn't obey the king. Why? Because the people living there were high on their own supply of, "We are the descendants of the Roman Empire" pride. Their attitude was, "Who are you, barbarian scumbags? You rootless Germans come down here, set up some weird country called the Frankish Kingdom, and you dare try to rule us? We're the heirs of Rome. Who the hell are you?" Even in this chaos, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, had managed to hang on even after the Western Empire collapsed. And in this exact situation, someone caught the eye of the Frankish king. Who was it? The Bishop of Rome, who had been left high and dry.
The king of the Franks saw an opportunity. He saw the Bishop of Rome, who had been left completely out in the cold. As I said, the people of the Frankish kingdom didn't really obey their king. The local lords and landowners could stage a coup at any moment. The country's political situation was a total mess. And in this mess, the Frankish king spotted the Pope. He must have thought, if I get friendly with the Pope, I think I could get something good out of this. Here's what that means. There were a lot of Christians within the Frankish kingdom. These former citizens of the Roman Empire wouldn't listen to the king. They listened more to the Bishop of Rome for religious reasons. The king's calculation was, these Christians won't listen to me. If I want to rule them effectively and make them obey, I need to put on a show with the Pope. If I stage a political spectacle with the Pope, these people who ignore me will finally listen. So what does he do? He arranges a coronation. This creates the iconic image of the Pope crowning Charlemagne. Before this coronation, the Christians were thinking, the Frankish kingdom? Just a bunch of rootless Germanic barbarians. But then they see this and go, wait, His Holiness the Pope is crowning him? He's a king endorsed by the Pope? Their whole tune changes. I see now. He's a king acknowledged by our Pope. I thought he was just some illegitimate ruler, but he must be worthy if the leader of us Catholics, the Pope himself, is placing a crown on his head. This is how Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, and the Pope joined forces. And the second this happened, the Pope seized the opportunity to declare, I am the top dog of all Christianity. He made another play for it. I am once again the supreme archbishop of the entire Catholic Christian world. His confidence was back. Why? By crowning the emperor, he gained immense influence and powerful backing. He planned to sideline the Archbishop of Constantinople and try again to become the most powerful archbishop, the undisputed champion of global Catholic Christianity. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but by teaming up with the Franks, these Germanic foreigners who happened to be really tough and formidable fighters, he got his swagger back. And what came out of this? The Holy Roman Empire. Starting with the coronation of the Frankish king, Charlemagne, the Pope and the Emperor came up with a name together. The legitimate heir to the Roman Empire, sacred and chosen by God. That is the Holy Roman Empire. You can just imagine the reaction. Whoa, with a name like that, wait, so we Germans are actually citizens of the Holy Roman Empire? This kind of thinking gives you a lethal dose of national pride, a cocktail of religious fervor and patriotism that makes your chest swell. They chose this name specifically for that political purpose. With a name like the Holy Roman Empire, you can bet the Pope's influence was massive. It started to become incredibly powerful. The Pope could say one word and people would be like, wow, God's one true representative, our Holy Father, thank you. If he just walked by, people would be bowing, oh, your holiness. But just as the Pope's influence was on the rise, it fizzled out again. Why? Because the Frankish king's damn sons started fighting amongst themselves again. After a few generations after Charlemagne died, the Frankish kingdom split into 3 parts: West, Middle, and East Francia. And what does splitting into 3 mean? It means now there are 3 kings. They're all trying to grab territory from each other, purging rivals, and if they even suspect someone might stage a coup, they drag them off and crush them. They started purging people left and right to consolidate their own power. Their relationship with the Pope and coronations weren't the priority anymore. They were too busy carving up the land and eliminating any potential threats to their power. But later, Middle and East Francia merge. They combine to become the Kingdom of Germany. So now it's split between West Francia and the German kingdom. And it's here that the King of Germany, like Charlemagne before him, goes to have a coffee with the Pope. King Otto I of Germany gets a coronation and the Holy Roman Empire is rebooted. Why did the German kingdom adopt the Holy Roman Empire title again? It's like this.
Even today, if a politician is known to be friendly with the pastor of a huge megachurch, members of that church are more likely to lean towards that politician. Now, imagine the emperor is tight with the pope. What do you think the common people who revere the pope as His Holiness are going to do? Through this process, the power of the Holy Roman Empire grew stronger. It got the Pope's coronation. It pacified public opinion, and coups became less frequent. This is how the Holy Roman Empire became a state where the kings, that is, the emperors, power and authority became immense. But it wasn't just the Holy Roman Empire anymore. Why? Because Christianity was spreading. Catholicism started spreading all across Europe. So you have countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. They all have their own kings, but they also now have large Christian populations. So what happens? They all have to start bowing their heads to the Pope. Why? They're basically going to the Pope and saying, "Your Holiness, please recognize me as king too. Put out a good word for me." You get the picture. Why? Because their subjects were overwhelmingly Christian. So countless European kings started asking the Pope to please tell everyone you're okay with me being king. Word got around, and soon kings from all over were like, "Pope, my man, you're the best. Let's be friends. You have my respect." And they'd hang a picture of themselves with the Pope in their palace. That, right there, is the history of medieval Europe. Why are the Pope and Catholicism such an indispensable part of understanding this era? Because the very system of European states was built with the Pope. The people were all Christians, they all looked up to the Pope, and even the kings had to bow their heads to him without question. For example, say the King of Belgium said something like, "That Pope guy is kind of a jerk." The Pope could immediately tell the people of Belgium, "Saints of Belgium, your king is a heretic, a spawn of Satan. Go and kill him now, and God will absolve you." And just like that, the King of Belgium would be totally screwed. That's why every king in Europe had no choice but to bow to the Pope. And that's why for medieval Europe, you absolutely have to understand the history of the Pope, of Christianity, of Catholicism. So, what's the problem now? There's a country we've forgotten about, isn't there? Where? The Eastern Roman Empire. We need to talk about the Byzantine Empire, which was barely hanging on while getting hammered by the Islamic states of the Middle East. The Eastern Roman Empire was also a Christian nation. But what did I tell you at the beginning? I told you to erase everything you thought you knew about what Catholic means.
At this point, the name for Christianity was Catholic. Remember, all of Christianity was being called Catholic. But while the Pope in Rome was busy with coronations and establishing the Holy Roman Empire, he was solidifying his claim. The top dog of all Christianity in the world, i.e. Catholicism, is me. I even have my own lands, you punks. Who is the Supreme Archbishop of all global Catholic Christianity? It's the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. With that, the game was already over in all of Europe. While the Eastern Roman Empire was busy fighting for its life, in Western and Central Europe, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, had become the real deal, the undisputed head, the top dog of Catholic Christianity. The whole atmosphere had shifted. It was like, everyone except us over here. The vibe in Europe was now set in stone. Oh, the supreme leader of our religion, Christianity, also known as Catholicism, is the one and only Pope in Rome. The Eastern Empire was completely screwed. So what about that ecumenical patriarch of the Catholic world that the Byzantine Empire had unilaterally created back in Constantinople? To the rest of Europe, that was someone else's story. They were basically saying, "We don't care what you call your guy over there. For us, the Pope in Rome is the top dog." That's where things stood. The title in Constantinople had become meaningless. And so they started fighting like crazy, for real this time. The Pope in Rome is screaming heretics at Constantinople, and Constantinople is screaming heretics right back. They're going at it. From Constantinople's point of view, it was, I'm supposed to be the ecumenical patriarch of the Catholic religion, and that guy in Rome stole my title.
But the tide had already turned, and it was an insurmountable difference. The number of people in the West who believed the Pope of Rome was the head of Catholicism was overwhelming. The population difference was off the charts. The consensus had completely shifted to, of course, Catholicism is our religion, and the head of Catholicism is the Pope in Rome. They basically lost the brand name Catholic. In Europe, the supreme leader of the religion using the name Catholic had by default become the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So what were they supposed to do? Since it became difficult to use the name Catholic, they started using a new name to signify we are the true, correct church, the Orthodox Church.
All right, our story kicks off with the entrance of the Orthodox Church. Originally, the name Catholic had been used since the 300s AD simply to mean the universal church. Back then, the Archbishop of Rome, the Pope, wasn't exactly seen as the supreme leader of everything, not even close. But then this Pope starts holding coronations for emperors and orchestrating all sorts of political shows, steadily growing his power. And before you know it, in Western and Central Europe, the idea that the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church became standard procedure. The vibe had already completely shifted. Now, you can imagine how much this ticked off the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. They were like, "Excuse me? We're the OGs here." But it was already too late to turn the tide. So they said, "Screw it. They're the fakes. We are the true Orthodox Church," and started calling themselves the Orthodox Church. Since they were in the East, they're also known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. See, are you getting the feeling that the history of Christianity is basically world history? This whole split between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches was a massive event that shook the world. If you don't get this part, you can't understand what the Holy Roman Empire was or why nations were constantly splitting up and fighting each other. Anyway, as the power of the Eastern Orthodox Church weakened, the power of the Roman Catholic Pope skyrocketed. And this is how medieval Europe truly began. And if you had to sum up medieval Europe in a single word, that word would be indulgences. Indulgences are the perfect example of how the Roman Catholic Church became a stagnant swamp, just unbelievably corrupt as it entered the Middle Ages. Here's what an indulgence was. For people worrying, "I've sinned, what if I go to hell?" the church would basically say, "Just buy this piece of paper, you'll be fine." Honestly, you can't just blame the church's corruption. From the people's perspective, common sense says if you sin, you should repent and decide, "I'm going to live a better life from now on." But that took too much effort, and they still didn't want to go to hell. This whole mess was created by a fundamental human weakness, not wanting to go to hell and being terrified of death. Where there's a demand, there's a supply, right? People started looking for an easy way out of damnation. As this era of corruption continued, what happens next? Martin Luther's 95 Theses. He was the one who said the Roman Catholic Church is seriously wrong. It's full of contradictions. Where in the Bible does it even mention a pope? And you guys selling indulgences is also completely messed up. He laid out all these problems in his 95 Theses. The 95 Theses meticulously picked apart the contradictions of the Roman Catholic religion. But just because Martin Luther posted his theses didn't mean the Reformation started immediately. It's not like Luther came out from day one with guns blazing shouting, "The Catholic Church is rotten to the core, time for a revolution." In the beginning, the original intent of Luther's 95 Theses was more like, "Our Roman Catholic Church has some shady corners and a lot of problems right now, but I believe our Pope is capable of change. If we all get our act together, we can clean up this corruption." But the Pope's reaction was to yell, "Seize that heretic and kill him immediately!" And with that over-the-top response, the Reformation officially kicked off. "We need a clean religion again, a Christianity that properly follows Jesus Christ, one that goes by the book, the Bible. Where in the Bible is there a Pope? Where does it say to sell indulgences?" People started to agree, thinking,
Martin Luther has a point. They started saying we need to create and believe in a proper form of Christianity, and a new branch of Christianity began to spread. And what was that? The emergence of Protestantism. Protestantism spread across Europe at an incredible speed. Why so fast? You'd be wrong to think it was just because the Catholic Church was corrupt, so it's time for a clean religion. There was another reason. And what was that? Politics needs religion, and sometimes it wants to swap out that religion for a new one. That's the key. Here's what I mean. Back in medieval Europe, centered around the Holy Roman Empire, a single word from the Pope could turn any king into a heretic. Let's say the king of country A did something the Pope didn't like. The Pope could just declare, "People of God, your king is a rotten heretic, a devil." And then the people would be like, "Get him! His Holiness the Pope said we can take him down. God has given us permission." And they'd drag the king off his throne. In a situation like that, all of Europe was basically in the Pope's palm, and the kings were sick of it. Tons of rulers who couldn't stand this started thinking, wait a minute, Protestantism doesn't have a pope. Does that mean we don't have to walk on eggshells around him anymore? Jackpot! With Protestantism, there was no pope to push them around, no one to tell them what to do. It was a total no-brainer. So, the Reformation spread to countless European countries because kings and lords adopted it, shouting, "A popeless Protestantism that can't mess with our royal power? Yes, please!" Of course, England was in the same boat. The Pope constantly meddling in the affairs of the British royal family was getting really annoying. The stage was perfectly set for England to adopt Protestantism just to give the Pope the finger, but then, out of left field, England creates the Church of England.
So what's going on here? Instead of adopting Protestantism, England just randomly creates its own religion. From the English perspective at the time, Protestantism was great for getting out from under the Pope's thumb. But on the other hand, kings sometimes need to use religion to rally the people and for some good old-fashioned PR, you know? And Protestantism didn't really offer much to work with in that department. They needed that vibe, like when the Pope held the coronation for Charlemagne of the Frankish kingdom, making the people think, wow, the crown is being placed by God's representative, the Pope, so it must truly be God's will. Adopting Protestantism would get rid of that kind of performance. So they thought, let's just create our own in-house Pope. By pretending to create something sort of like Protestantism while setting up their in-house Pope, they could pull a fast one and announce, "Behold, the Church of England, a new religion that has cleansed itself of corruption." The people would be fooled into thinking, finally, as a result of the Reformation, a new church has come to England. The English government spearheaded the creation of the Church of England so they could use this domestic pope for royal coronations and all sorts of other things. And who was this in-house pope? The Archbishop of Canterbury. That's who. They created the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury and started using him like their own personal pope. The moment the Church of England was declared the state religion, the country erupted. People were furious, saying, "These guys blew off the corrupt Catholic Church only to turn around and create a fake state-controlled religion? This is total BS." For those who genuinely wanted a pure religion, the Church of England looked like a complete and utter scam. For people who wanted to believe in a faithful, fundamental religion, just as it's written in the Bible, the situation was absurd. And more people started to feel this way. People started declaring, "We won't believe in anything but a new, pure religion. We're not buying into the Church of England." As their numbers grew, the English government basically said, "Hey, if you won't believe, then just get lost. Get out of our country." Those who resisted were often arrested, tortured, or beaten. Eventually, over 90% of the British population came to follow the Church of England. The English government's custom-built religion for political maneuvering had actually succeeded. In this climate, from the government's point of view, the people who absolutely refused to accept the Church of England were basically seen as rebels trying to stir up a civil war.
They were seen as people throwing a wrench in the works while the political machine was running smoothly. The people who insisted on a pure religion over the Church of England argued, we must return to the religion of the Bible, a pure religion, to evangelicalism, to fundamentalism. And who were these folks? They were the Puritans. That's who. Remember how the King of England kept cracking down on the Puritans who were calling for a pure, fundamentalist evangelical faith, telling them, hey, if you won't conform, then get out. So the Puritans said, fine, we're leaving this corrupted place. To follow our religious beliefs, to believe in a pure and fundamental religion, we will leave this island of Britain. And where did they go? To the New World. America. That's where. And finally, with the Puritans, the history of America truly begins. Thanks for sticking with me through what might have been a boring story up to this point. You've been troopers. Because now, my favorite part begins. The Age of Discovery. LOL.
If you want to be a Protestant so badly, just get out of my country. They were told to get lost, so where did they go? To the North American continent. But why North America, of all places? To understand that, you need to understand the Age of Discovery. There are so many misconceptions about the Age of Discovery. There's a very good reason why people would leave their own country, get on a boat, and sail across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. To understand the Age of Discovery, what do we need to understand? We need to understand the Islamic Empire. The religion of Islam emerged in the 600s AD. After its founder, Muhammad, died, the Islamic Empire expanded its territory at an insane rate. They took over almost the entire Middle East, all of North Africa, and even advanced into the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal and Spain are. During this time, trade and commerce in the Mediterranean were completely dominated by the Islamic world. I mean, of course they did. Look at how much territory they controlled. But why did they have such a monopoly on trade? Well, what were the hottest items in Europe during the Middle Ages? Chinese goods, made in China, and Indian goods. They were incredibly popular. But back then, to get goods from China and India, you absolutely had to pass through one region, the Middle East. And because of that, Islamic merchants were the middlemen who controlled everything. The European nations were like, seriously, the Muslims are selling everything. How are we supposed to make a living? And among them, one country was getting the shortest end of the stick. Which one? Portugal. Just look at Portugal's location. For Portugal to buy pepper, it had to start in India, travel the Silk Road, go through an Islamic merchant, get it shipped across the Mediterranean, get its price jacked up again in Spain, and only then would it arrive in Portugal. It was a hopeless situation. They had to buy it at an insane markup. So who kicked open the door to the Age of Discovery in medieval Europe? Portugal did. And why were they the first? Because they were sick of the middlemen's price gouging. It was just too expensive. They felt like they were going to go bankrupt. With their powerful neighbor Spain always being a threat and Islamic merchants dominating trade, they took to the seas first simply to survive. So you can think of the Age of Discovery as being started by Portugal. Back when the Age of Discovery began in the early to mid-1400s, sailors were barely leaving the Mediterranean. Who would dare cross the Atlantic? The technology to sail that far simply didn't exist yet. You never knew when your boat would run dry, and if you couldn't stop for supplies, you'd just die. Setting out on a ship was a massive gamble. So Portugal started looking for a navigator who could handle that massive gamble, that long voyage. And who was that? Bartholomew Dias. To get to India from Portugal, you had to go around the Cape of Good Hope at the very bottom of Africa. And what did Bartholomew Dias do? He's the guy who made it to the Cape and back. And why the Cape of Good Hope? When Diaz first got there, he called it the Cape of Storms. True to its name, the storms were raging and the waves were insane. But the King of Portugal, wanting to inspire his men to have hope and bring back that pepper, started calling it the Cape of Good Hope. Portugal was now looking for the next navigator. Who can we hire to make it all the way to India and back?
And just then, some con man shows up. I can get there faster than anyone. This con man appears out of nowhere and claims that if you give him money, he can get to India direct, super fast. He said he could bring back pepper in no time. If you go in the opposite direction, it's way faster. Give me money. This is a map they used in Europe back then. It's Ptolemy's world map passed down from ancient Roman times. People often mistakenly think that medieval people believed the earth was flat, but that's not true. Since the time of ancient Rome, anyone who was anyone knew the earth was more or less round. So this con man's claim that the earth is round so you can get there faster by going the other way actually had some logic to it. If you look at the map, besides Europe and Asia, continents like North America, South America, and Oceania are pretty much missing. So the calculation was that if you sailed west from Europe, you'd arrive directly in India. It was a very plausible sounding scam. So this con man asked Portugal for an investment, but they didn't fall for it and told him to get lost. Since his pitch didn't work in Portugal, where do you think he went next? Right next door to Spain to start running his scam there. The con man said, "What are you going to do if Portugal gets to India first and brings back all the pepper? Spain is also struggling, buying pepper at high prices from Islamic merchants. Shouldn't you get pepper from India even faster than Portugal?" He was laying on the ultimate con. And who was this con man? Columbus. That's who. People tend to overestimate Columbus. Of course, he opened up a sea route to the New World that later became incredibly valuable. But this guy wasn't exactly a great benevolent figure. He was a massive fraud. Columbus believed the earth was round. He figured the earth is a sphere, Spain is here, India's on the other side, and there's nothing in between. At the time, Europeans had no idea that the North and South American continents even existed. They thought the planet only had Europe, Africa, and Asia, so sailing west would take them straight to India. So, Spain, duped by the con man Columbus, gave him a ton of money and sent him on a voyage to bring back pepper ASAP. But here's where the problem started. He went out there and ran into the Americas, LOL. Yep, he ran right into it. A continent that didn't exist in the minds of Europeans was blocking his path. The moment he landed on this continent that was in his way, what does Columbus say? It's India! Yep, he says it's India. What's the proof? I don't know. It's just India. And the people who live here? They must be Indians. From the Spanish government's perspective, they'd thrown all this money at him to bring back pepper, and all he did was talk about India, India, without bringing back a single peppercorn. Why? Because it wasn't India. But while Columbus was screwing around over here, Portugal sent Vasco da Gama, who went and reached the real India. While Columbus was spouting nonsense in Central America claiming it was India, Vasco da Gama had reached the real deal. He came back with boxes of pepper telling stories like, "Whoa guys, in India, people ride elephants and get this, they eat curry with their hands. No spoons. That's what India's like." Meanwhile, Columbus was still over there sticking to his bluff that he'd found India.
In the end, Columbus was treated as a con man back in Spain, and his final years were quite miserable. He died of syphilis. Let's go get pepper and gold like Portugal. It was in this atmosphere that countless other European nations followed Portugal and Spain and rushed out to sea. And that's the age of discovery. If Portugal and Spain were pioneering routes for pepper and bringing back massive amounts of gold, how would the other European nations feel? They'd feel threatened, obviously. In international politics, there are no permanent friends. You have to make a move before you get stabbed in the back. Regardless, the route Columbus took on his bluff turned out to be useful. He made the trip 4 times. Using his nautical charts, numerous European countries started to think, we can't just focus on India and pepper. Who knows if there's gold or silver in Central, South, or North America? And so they began to move beyond pepper and attempt to colonize a third option, the continents of North and South America. But here's the problem. South America had plenty of decent spots to colonize.
What's the weather like? It's near the equator. Hot, humid, perfect for plantation farming, like sugarcane. Anything you planted grew well. But North America, it was a whole lot of nothing. You get there and the ground is frozen solid in the winter, and the four seasons are brutally distinct. And who were the people trying to build colonies in North and South America? They were Europeans, especially from the Mediterranean coast, people used to a Mediterranean climate. North America has 4 distinct seasons, but what's the Mediterranean like? Mild winters, mild summers, great weather, temperate. These folks who spent their lives picking olives and making yogurt show up in North America and think, this place is uninhabitable. It was just too harsh. And beyond that, if the soil conditions are different, you have to grow even something as simple as corn differently. Things like that made it tough in many ways. And was that it? No. You get to North America, and there are natives with peacock or turkey feathers in their hair, shooting arrows, throwing spears. It was chaos. And the farming sucked. So it became abandoned land. The headache of going there, driving out the natives, clearing the land to plant corn and beans, it was too much trouble, so they decided, let's just not go. Meanwhile, colonization from Central to South America was going surprisingly well. Spain showed up in suits of armor and just wiped out places like the Aztec, Maya, and Inca empires and took everything for themselves. Spain was doing very well for itself down there, but not in North America. But then there was a group of people who willingly chose to go to the self-abandoned land of North America, a place where farming was terrible and natives were constantly throwing spears and shooting arrows. And who were they? The Puritans, that's who.
All right, now all the pieces fit together, don't they? The founding of America didn't begin with some noble religious ideal. It was the end result of a massive butterfly effect, starting with a fight over a church's name, followed by the political jackpot calculations of kings, the desperate struggles of merchants trying to save money on pepper, and the epic bluff of a single con man. In the end, what is history? On the surface, it's dressed up in grand justifications, but when you look underneath, it's always a crazy soap opera tangled up with the most basic human desires: money, power, and survival.
So, who were the Puritans? They were people who left England seeking religious freedom after the Church of England was established. From the British government's perspective, they were outcasts. From their own perspective, they were people who wanted to protect their faith. But out of all the places in the world, why on earth did they go to North America? Because nobody else would. It was pretty much the only place left to go. Where else were ordinary civilians armed with nothing but their faith supposed to go? South America was already claimed by countries like Spain, but North America was seen as empty. So they went because it was open. To the land that other countries wouldn't take even if it was offered for free, the Puritans began their journey for the sake of religious freedom. The journey was a staggering 6,600 kilometers, or over 4,100 miles. Even a straight line from England to New York is 4,100 miles. That's a truly immense distance. This wasn't an era where you could just slap a motor on a boat and chug fuel across the ocean. They traveled by raising sails, harnessing the wind, and rowing by hand. It was a brutal, hellish journey. Many people died along the way. And what about food? There were no refrigerators. They likely survived by catching fish, smoking them, and boiling them into a thick stew like a chowder. The 4,100-mile journey typically took 2 months. Imagine being adrift on the vast open ocean for 2 months. It's just insane to think about. But even after arriving, the Puritans didn't just step right onto the land. The native inhabitants were known to fiercely resist strangers with bows and arrows. So they decided to scope things out first. Hey, take a look through the telescope and see if there are any natives on the coast. Take a small boat and do a quick recon mission. They quietly and sneakily scouted the area. And here's an interesting fact. When they arrived, they were starving.
They discovered what looked like burial mounds left by the natives, and when they dug them up, they found a huge stash of corn. The Puritans stole and ate the corn that the natives had buried to survive the winter. They broke one of the 10 Commandments almost immediately upon arrival. Anyway, after scoping things out, they finally landed on the coast of Plymouth in 1620. Plymouth Rock is located in what is now Massachusetts. There's even a rock there, famously engraved with the year 1620 to commemorate their arrival. Now, what was the nationality of these Puritans who landed on North America? They were English, of course. At this point, the concept of an American didn't exist. Just erase it from your mind. These Puritans who first set foot on the North American continent are called the Pilgrim Fathers by American historians. And this name itself is used politically. The idea is our American ancestors were these great pilgrims who with devout faith undertook a pilgrimage, left the country of England, and endured great hardship to cross to North America to protect their religion. They give them this grand, heroic title. It makes sense, as religion is considered very important in America. You might wonder, why Pilgrim Fathers and not Pilgrim Mothers? Well, in those days, the source of all life was thought to be the male, the father. The belief was that life could only be created when a man's seed entered a woman's body, so all beginnings were seen as male. Women were considered to play the role of receiving and nurturing that seed. Because of this prevailing view, words like fathers were commonly used. But here's something you shouldn't misunderstand. Some people exaggerate this story, framing the Pilgrim Fathers as the beginning of America. That's not really accurate. You shouldn't think of it in such grand terms. Honestly, these people just came here and lived. They had very little to do with the later process of Britain taking control of the entire North American continent. The idea that the Pilgrims founded America is just a bit of dramatic spice added to history. Their arrival wasn't some major catalyst for the founding of the United States. There's no need to assign it that much importance. In any case, the Puritans finally landed on the North American continent, December 20th, 1620. After traveling 4,100 miles over 2 months, you can only imagine how much they had suffered. They were starving, and to make matters worse, they arrived in the middle of winter. They had to build shelters immediately or they would all freeze to death. They frantically began digging into the earth, gathering wood, and even breaking apart the very ship they arrived on. They started building houses by any means necessary. As the Puritans were desperately working, a Native American suddenly appeared. Everyone tensed up. What do? We heard they shoot arrows at strangers. We're about to freeze. We're starving. What if they attack us? But then the native, wearing a headdress decorated with turkey feathers, suddenly spoke to them. Hey, how you doing? Everyone was completely stunned. A native just started speaking English. A so-called Indian, a name given to the natives of North America because Columbus mistakenly thought he was in India, was speaking English. As it turned out, there was exactly one native in the area who knew how to speak the language. This native even helped the Puritans, giving them the corn his people had buried to eat during the winter. The Puritans had come prepared for the worst, thinking, we're in for it now. They're going to attack us with arrows. So when an English-speaking native showed up and treated them kindly, they were completely bewildered. There was a reason for this. A few years before the Puritans arrived, the English had sent soldiers to kidnap 5 natives. European countries were preparing to colonize North America and needed interpreters to communicate with the local population. You can't negotiate if you can't speak the language. So they kidnapped 5 men, taught them English, and brought them back to North America. But as soon as they returned, they were met with a volley of arrows and spears. The soldiers were all killed, and the captive natives scattered. The very man who greeted the Puritans with, "Hey, how are you?" was one of those 5 who had been kidnapped. But that's strange, right? Why would he be so kind after being kidnapped? Because this native knew something the others didn't. He knew if we mess with these people, we are in deep trouble. Having been taken to England, he had seen their world. Their guns, their iron buildings, their technology was on a whole other level. He realized these white people, these English, have national power and military strength far beyond ours. If we provoke them, my tribe could be wiped out, just flattened like a bulldozer ran over us. So he concluded it was better to be on good terms with them rather than treating them as enemies. Thanks to this westernized native, they got along really well at first. He taught them how to farm corn, as the methods were different for this new land. And so the natives and the Puritans, the Pilgrim Fathers, became very close. They even hunted and roasted turkey together. The story goes that when the Puritans saw the natives hunting with bows, they said, "Why use a bow? You can just shoot it with a gun." And they'd shoot a wild turkey and roast it whole. Turkeys are native to North America and didn't exist in Europe, so this was the first time the Puritans had ever tasted one. After a successful harvest, made possible with the help of the natives, they held a feast together, praying, "Thank you, God, for granting us this bountiful harvest." This was the beginning of Thanksgiving Day. However, Thanksgiving isn't just about giving thanks. There's another interpretation that the holiday also serves to whitewash the later history when figures like George Washington drove Native Americans from their lands with guns, forcing them westward. In any case, the Puritans were fortunate to meet an English-speaking native in this strange land, and for a time, things went well. But now, I want you to completely forget that pleasant image of Puritans and natives peacefully sharing roasted turkey, because this is where England's systematic colonization begins, a bloody history of gunning down countless Native Americans. And where does it start? In Jamestown. This settlement was named after the reigning British monarch, King James I. From the very beginning, Jamestown was a place of constant conflict, with guns against bows, and the native resistance was fierce. When news of this reached England, the order came back, "The natives are ignorant savages. Send a large-scale military force and kill them all." And so a ruthless campaign of expansion began. So, for now, let's set aside the story of Thanksgiving and the friendly Pilgrim Fathers and turn to what happened next.
So why did the British government pursue colonization so aggressively in the 1600s? Because their backs were against the wall. Rumors were flying that neighboring countries like Spain and Portugal were mining for gold in their South American colonies and starting up plantation agriculture. With everyone around them getting into the colonization game, England started to feel the pressure. As its rivals' colonies grew, so did their economic power, which in turn strengthened their military might. This posed a massive threat to England, right? England couldn't just stand by and watch France, Spain, and Portugal get rich. So in their haste, they skipped any notion of assimilation or gentle persuasion with the natives of North America. They ignored that process entirely and just used brute force. England began its colonization in earnest by sending large armies to massacre the native population and take over the land. This is the colonial territory held by Britain up to 1754. Just north of them was France. While Britain was just nibbling away at its small slice of the pie, France had already claimed a massive territory throughout the early and mid-1600s. And what was France doing with all that land? They were making a fortune in the fur trade. At that time, one type of fur was incredibly fashionable in Europe: beaver fur. Beaver pelts were all the rage. It's not that beavers didn't exist in Europe, it's just that they had been hunted to near extinction there. But in North America, around the Great Lakes region, the place was crawling with beavers. There was an absolutely massive population. So, France claimed this land specifically to get in on the fur trade. Beavers thrive where there are plenty of rivers and lakes, right? So they began trapping the massive beaver population around the Great Lakes region. The problem was, France had it all to themselves. From England's point of view, this was unacceptable. Hey, why do you get all the profit? We need to trap beavers too. And with that,
a war over beaver pelts began between France and England in the colonies. And what was that war? The French and Indian War. That's what the textbooks call it.
As both the British and French colonies expanded, they inevitably clashed. But doesn't that raise a question? If France and Britain were fighting, why is it called the French and Indian War? While France and Britain were claiming these territories, numerous Native American tribes were living there. Some of these tribes allied with the French, and others sided with the British. Each tribe made its own calculation for survival. It's better for our tribe to side with the French, or no, we have to side with the British. So from the British perspective, they wanted to create a certain narrative. They wanted it to seem like those French people attacked the Native Americans that we, the British, were trying to protect, so we had no choice but to fight. That's why they named it the French and Indian War, to give it the nuance of being a war between the French and their native allies. But in reality, besides this war, there was another major conflict happening in Europe at the time, known as the 7 Years' War. They were fought at almost the same time. Shortly after the French and Indian War began, all of Europe was entangled in a chaotic conflict involving Prussia, Austria, Russia, France, Britain, Sweden, Spain, and more. The fight in Europe was essentially mirrored in North America. The dates of the two wars almost completely overlap. If you look at the dates, the 7 Years' War lasted from 1756 to 1763, and the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. So there was no time to even separate them. When the 7 Years' War started, the fighting just extended to the colonies. You can basically think of it as a buy one, get one free deal for war. When the 7 Years' War ended, this one ended right along with it. But in both the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, Britain was the ultimate victor. How did they win? Well, the war lasted until 1763, right? This was precisely when France was becoming a complete mess internally. France was in total chaos. The Palace of Versailles was being extravagantly expanded, the people were crying, "Give us bread," signaling the coming of the French Revolution, and the nobility was living in extreme luxury. To fight a war in North America, you need supplies from Europe. But during this process, French officers and nobles were embezzling defense funds and military supplies, a clear sign of a failing state. They were selling supplies meant for North America on the black market. The situation was a total disaster, and that's why France lost. With France's defeat, the map of North America, which had been divided 3 ways between Spain, France, and Britain in 1754, changed dramatically. The former French territories were taken over by Spain, and Britain got most of the rest. North America effectively became a land dominated by British and Spanish influence. Now, you might think, wow, Britain defeated France and gained a massive amount of territory. They must have profited immensely. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because in war, even the victor suffers huge losses. Losing is just a bigger disaster. A common misconception is that winning a war is pure profit. It's not. War drains a nation's resources. Let me explain why. Imagine a war breaks out. People who were working hard and earning money have to shut down their shops and get drafted into the army. What happens then? They stop earning money. The domestic economy grinds to a halt. In short, it's devastating. If the war drags on, there's no way out. So even if you win a war like this, you've suffered a major loss. And that's what happened to Britain's finances. After the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, the British treasury was completely broke. So Britain decided to implement reforms, specifically tax system reforms. And what does tax system reform mean? It's obvious. It means you're going to have to pay more taxes. The country is in a tough spot, so we need you to pay more in taxes. That was the message. They started trying to fill the hole in the national budget, caused by the war, with the people's tax money. But there was a problem. If they had only collected taxes from people in Britain, it might have been fine, but they demanded that the people in the colonies pay a huge amount of taxes as well. You might think, what's wrong with asking them to pay taxes?
But the situation was a bit different back then. The people living in the colonies were often poor commoners from England who, believing they'd be stuck in poverty forever if they stayed, crossed the Atlantic with a dream to build a new life for themselves. These people had received no support from the government. For generations, they had endured incredible hardship, tilling the land, working hard to build homes and communities. Then, all of a sudden, the government shows up and says, "Pay more taxes." It was infuriating. It's the perfect setup for that classic line. What has the government ever done for us? That's exactly what they started saying. At first, Britain tried to collect taxes with these two acts, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. Through its tax reforms, Britain created these two laws to start collecting revenue. The Stamp Act isn't complicated, it's about paper. They basically slapped a tax on every kind of paper people used frequently. Passports, books, newspapers, licenses. If it was paper, it got taxed. That was the Stamp Act. Then, 2 years later, they passed the Townshend Acts, which were even more outrageous. They imposed taxes on almost all essential imported goods, like lead, glass, paint, and tea. They figured paper alone wasn't enough. From the colonists' perspective, it was, what have you ever done for us to suddenly raise our taxes like this? The backlash was predictably huge. Normally, before you raise taxes, you're supposed to build a case for it, create a pretext. But they just hiked them without any warning, so of course the resistance was fierce. What do you think the colonists did when they were suddenly hit with a tax bomb? They rose up in protest. They were furious. We came here with nothing, cultivated this wilderness, grew corn, fought the natives ourselves, and survived by hunting wild turkeys. Why are you taxing us now? What has the government ever done for us? A massive uproar ensued. The colonists began to protest fiercely, particularly around the port of Boston. The protest grew so intense that the British government had to back down. Sorry, we get it. We won't collect the taxes. If you're going to react like this, we have no choice. They repealed most of the tax policies. However, there was one tax they insisted on keeping, one thing they felt they absolutely had to collect on: tea. They said, we'll drop everything else, but we have to collect on the tax on tea. Why were they so obsessed with tea? Because at the time, the British East India Company's warehouses were overflowing with a massive surplus of tea. Even today, when inventory piles up, it costs money to dispose of it, right? It was the same situation. They needed to sell this tea fast. So to get rid of the surplus tea, the British government declared, we will sell this tea at a dirt cheap price. The price of tea became much cheaper than before. Why? Because they completely upended the distribution system. Normally, the East India Company would bring tea from places like India or Sri Lanka, sell it to merchants in London, who would then sell it to wholesalers, who sold it to retailers, who finally sold it to the colonists in North America. The price was naturally high. They simplified this by allowing the East India Company to ship the tea directly to North America, bypassing the London merchants. By cutting out 2 or 3 steps in the distribution chain, the price of tea dropped dramatically. It became so cheap that they figured it would be fine to add a small tax on it. When tea was first introduced to Europe, it was expensive, like pepper, a luxury that nobles drank formally as part of their English breakfast. But it was now becoming a cheap beverage that anyone could afford. But even with the British government selling tea at such a low price, it didn't make much of a difference in the colonies. People didn't bother buying the British tea. Why? Because they already had access to something even cheaper: smuggled Dutch tea. Everyone was already drinking Dutch tea that had been brought in secretly without any taxes. Since they were all drinking this smuggled tea, nobody really cared whether Britain taxed its tea or lowered its price. But this is exactly what leads to the Boston Tea Party.
You've probably heard people say, it's wrong to use the word Indian, you should say Native American. But did you know this? The man we learn about as the discoverer of the Americas, Christopher Columbus, he initially thought the American continent was India. That's why he started calling the native people who lived there Indians. Because of this, the word Indian is often said to carry a discriminatory nuance. What's interesting, though, is that many indigenous people in the United States don't actually mind being called Indian. I've heard that more often, they introduce themselves simply as natives. And if you think about it, why attach the word American to them at all? Technically, they weren't Americans to begin with. The argument that Indian is a disrespectful term but American is acceptable is actually a bit absurd. Columbus insisted until his death that he had reached India. At that time, there was a man who was close to Columbus named Amerigo Vespucci. This Amerigo Vespucci was the one who realized this wasn't India. He thought, I thought this was India, but it's a new continent that was blocking the way. It's not India, and it's not Asia. It's a third continent. He returned to Spain and argued continuously that this place needed a different name, and he maintained this until his death. In the end, his claim turned out to be correct, right? So, in his honor, they began to call the continent America, after his name. So the term Native American is also in a way a ridiculous name as it's named after a European explorer. It's not just Indian that's a strange term. It might be better to just call them natives or indigenous peoples. The bottom line is that whether it's Indian, Indio, or Native American, they are all strange names given to them by outsiders. Of course, since the United States now occupies that land, one can call them Native Americans. However, the argument that Indian is wrong and Native American is correct, or that Indian is a sad word steeped in colonial history, is not very persuasive. It's more of a case of, well, they live on a land that is now the United States and the national territory has been defined, so let's just call them Native Americans. The people who advocate for the term Native American today are mostly modern white Americans. They have parts of their history that they are uncomfortable with, like how they forced the people they called Indians onto reservations. Because they carry this historical burden, they've created a new term. But this new term is really just a word to make themselves feel more comfortable. It was not a term that the indigenous people themselves originally asked to be called. On the contrary, the word Indian has historical value as a term. In history books, you'll often see it preserved in names like the French and Indian War. Trying to change all of that now could cause confusion. And as I've heard, many Native people themselves are not particularly offended by being called Indian. In the end, what matters is communication. If, in the future, the Native peoples of America collectively demand a different name, then we can change it then. It's just good for us to be clear on this one point. Native American is absolutely not a term that the indigenous peoples of North America asked to be called. That is a clear fact.
All right, everyone, let's really think about what was going on in the North American colonies back then. The truth is, whether Britain taxed tea or made it cheaper, the colonists couldn't have cared less. And why is that? Because most of them were already drinking cheap smuggled Dutch tea anyway. But it's in this totally unrelated situation that the Boston Tea Party happens. And this is the part that's so incredibly weird. Think about it. They weren't going to buy British tea anyway, and the British government actually made it cheaper, so from a consumer's perspective, there was literally no downside, right? So why in the world did the Boston Tea Party happen? It's because you had people with a hardcore activist streak, the kind of people who believe protesting makes the world better. All we have to do is hit the streets. More and more people started buying into this idea. And it kind of makes sense. Remember how I told you they protested furiously against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, and a huge protest broke out in Boston? Well, starting with that success, the number of people who got a taste for protesting skyrocketed. And the problem with that is people started showing up with ambitions, thinking, hey, I can use this to become a politician. Yep, that's right. Ambitious political wannabes set the stage and riled up the public just like this. My fellow colonists, I'm sure you're all enjoying your smuggled Dutch tea, right? But that's not the point. Why do those pathetic Brits dare to tell us what to do without any consideration for our sovereignty, for our rights as people of the North American colonies? Sure, the tea is cheaper and we haven't lost any money, but are we just going to sit here and let Britain interfere in our lives? Who knows what they'll do next? That's the vibe. Britain had gotten rid of almost all the taxes, leaving just a tiny one on tea, which didn't even matter to us because we were drinking smuggled stuff anyway. But it was the principle of it. The fact that Britain is telling us what to do is what pisses me off. You feel me? Yeah, you feel me. So, the agitation starts like this, and then people who were paid off by these ambitious wannabe politicians, people hired by these political instigators, deliberately go to the Boston Harbor and start chucking tea chests into the sea. And that is the Boston Tea Party. It was all engineered from start to finish. The plan went something like this. First, dump all the tea sold by the British government to seriously piss off the British. Second, if a bloody conflict breaks out and a few of our guys die, look everyone, the British are killing us, the people of the North American colonies. That gives them the perfect angle for some major propaganda. Third, once you have the perfect justification for a coup and the coup succeeds, I'm a shoo-in for a politician. Ka-ching. This grand scheme was what? The Boston Tea Party. That's what it was. So they dressed up as Native Americans down at the Boston Harbor and caused a scene. And right on cue, just as planned, what do you know? The British government takes the bait. Look at these punks. How dare they throw our tea into the sea? Shut down the Boston Harbor immediately. Arrest every last one of those protesters. And just like that, they got the reaction they wanted. There were two masterminds behind the Boston Tea Party. The ones funding it from the shadows and engineering the whole thing. Their names were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. So, the two guys who orchestrated the Boston Tea Party, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Now, this Samuel Adams guy, for a full 10 years before the Tea Party, was the one running around shouting, "We need to stage a coup. Let's declare independence. We need to separate." He was a guy who was desperate to be a politician, just biding his time, waiting for a major protest to break out. In fact, his family had been a political family since the early to mid-1700s. The colonies had their own local politicians back then, you see. So, after singing his independence tune for 10 years, in 1773, he finally made the Boston Tea Party go boom. And then there's John Hancock. You know what this guy's job was? He was a tea smuggler. So, he hears the news that official British tea is about to come in at a ridiculously cheap price. He must have thought, oh, I'm screwed. I mean, his whole business was smuggling Dutch tea to sell it cheap. And now the official stuff is coming in even cheaper. His business was totally wrecked. He knew that he had to find another way, fast. So, there you have it. You've got Samuel Adams, the political operator who'd wanted to be a politician forever, and John Hancock, the smuggler who was panicking that cheap British tea would ruin his business. The Boston Tea Party was orchestrated primarily by these two men. And by the way, this tea smuggler, John Hancock, was the very first person to sign the American Declaration of Independence. Knowing that, you start to get a clearer picture of what kind of people were among America's founding fathers, don't you? Anyway,
Just as they planned, the British government cracks down on the colonists. They close the Boston Harbor, halt all imports and exports, dissolve the assembly, and start sending in more troops. What was the scenario they wanted? To get a rise out of the British, have a few colonists die in the ensuing violence, and then have the perfect image for their propaganda campaign, right? And now, the British government was setting the stage for them perfectly. On top of that, there was a book that was all the rage in the colonies at the time, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This book is what really started to solidify the idea among the British colonists that, yeah, we really need to split. Paine's Common Sense basically said this: does it make any common sense for this tiny little island nation, Britain, to rule over the vast continent of North America? It is common sense that we should be independent. It was all about this idea of common sense. With a book like this making the rounds, and with the Boston Tea Party as a catalyst, more and more people, including those guys who were waiting for their moment, got swept up in the agitation. A wave of independence sentiment washed over the colonies, and people were massively riled up, shouting, "Independence! Independence!" It was chaos. Sensing that the time has finally come, the most influential people in America gathered to seriously discuss independence. You've probably heard of them, the big shots from the colonies at the time, right? People like John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. They all get together. Of course, not all of them were there just for their own self-interest. There were definitely people who genuinely hoped to create a good country, but a whole lot of them were in it for themselves. And what do we call this meeting where these guys started talking about independence? The First and Second Continental Congresses. But word of this gets back to the British government. Hey, what are those colonists up to? Are they gathering to plot treason? As soon as news of the Continental Congress reached Britain, they cracked down even harder. British soldiers started doing random searches and imposing curfews, which the colonists thought, look at these guys, we're already dying for independence, and now they're searching us and locking us down? It was like pouring gasoline on a fire, right? They really pissed them off. And then, it finally happens. Bloodshed. In Lexington, Massachusetts, a colonist is shot and killed by British troops. The second that one person died, the guys who were waiting for their chance went wild with propaganda. Look, everyone, the British treat us, the people of North America, as less than human. They treat us like human garbage. Look, how much longer must we suffer at the hands of these tyrants? The wannabe politicians had just found their cheat code, and now the American Revolutionary War officially begins. To put it simply, it was a war started by British people living in the British colonies, staging a coup against their own motherland to build a new country. As the war kicks off, what do? They issue the American Declaration of Independence. Those same guys I mentioned, they all gathered again. You know that famous painting of them signing the Declaration of Independence. At first glance, it looks like they're all gathered for some noble purpose, signing one by one, right? Well, it had that meaning, but it also had another. It was also a kind of written pact to prevent each other from backing out or betraying the cause if the war against Britain went south. A pact. Because back then, each of the North American colonies had different representatives and completely different interests. Even though they were all saying, let's be independent, let's stage a coup, it wouldn't have been surprising if someone had betrayed the others once the war actually started. Seriously, even when America first became independent, it didn't control all this land. At first, it was just this much, only a fraction. Britain could have easily reconquered it, and it wouldn't have been weird for someone to switch sides based on their own interests. That's why they had to write such a thorough pact. And so, from 1775 to 1783, the American Revolutionary War raged on, a war between Great Britain and those trying to found the United States. Obviously, in the beginning, the British Empire was a powerhouse, but the colonists were fighting for their lives, so it was a back-and-forth struggle, and they managed to hold on. They were holding on, but suddenly, these guys pop up out of nowhere. France. France just jumps into the American Revolutionary War and starts providing massive support to the American independence movement. I mean, whether the US became a country or not, whether it fought with Britain or not, why would France care? It was someone else's problem. So why on earth did they get involved? I mentioned this before. The British and French colonies in North America fought like crazy over beaver fur, and back in Europe, they fought like crazy in the 7 Years' War. In other words, in European history, Britain and France are what? Eternal rivals. That's what I'm saying. They've almost never been on good terms. So their rival nation, Britain, is about to have its colonies split in half and break away. From France's point of view, what is that? It's a celebration, a party. It's a big thank you. But in the beginning, France didn't send troops directly. They were also struggling economically after the 7 Years' War, so a head-on confrontation with Britain was a bit much. So instead of fighting directly, they gave their full support by providing supplies to the American forces. But even with France helping from behind the scenes, how could the North American colonists possibly beat the British Empire? It was still an uphill battle. So what did the American leaders do? They sent diplomats. And who did they send them to? Only to the countries that had beef with Britain. You guys can't stand Britain either, right? We're about to break off a piece of their territory, so give us a hand. And what do you know? Several countries actually started sending soldiers to help the American founders. Chief among them were France, which had terrible relations with Britain over territory, the Netherlands, which was constantly clashing with them over colonies in Southeast Asia, and Spain, which fought them anytime they met in the Atlantic. These countries began to fully support the American cause with military aid. Oh, and did you know this? The Native Americans living in the colonies at the time, most of the tribes helped the British. Huh? Wait, Olivia, didn't you say the British were killing the natives with guns and swords? So why would the natives help the British? It doesn't really make sense, does it? From the natives' point of view, it was like this. Yeah, the British are bad guys, but if those so-called founding fathers who are staging this coup create their own country, it's going to be even worse for us. A ton of native tribes thought this way. They figured it was better for Britain to stay in control. That's why quite a few tribes sided with the British. And in the end, the American founders won the war. They actually defeated the British Empire. How could that have happened? I mean, sure, Spain, France, and the Netherlands helped, but their opponent was still the British Empire, right? But we've been overlooking something. And what is that? The power of Mother Nature.
We were overlooking the power of Mother Nature. Now look, the colonies over here want to break away and become independent, right? So for the British Army to fight them, what do they have to do? They have to come over by boat. And do you know how long it takes to get from here to here? 60 days. A full 2 months. 2 months! You might think, so what? Can't they just think of it as a 2-month cruise? Maybe today you could. Nowadays, ships have refrigerators, freezers, and all kinds of pantries, so you could cram 2 months' worth of food in there. But they didn't have any of that back then. So it was common for everyone to get scurvy. For example, in the famous game League of Legends, the sailor character eats an orange to cure himself. That's all based on this historical fact. For 2 months, they were coming over eating almost nothing but salted meat and fish. After suffering for 2 months to cross the Atlantic, by the time the soldiers disembarked, they were already ravaged by scurvy, looking like hell with sallow, yellow faces. The British Army had to fight in a near-death state. That's the condition they were in for the war. You see what I'm saying? This is one of the reasons why the geopolitical position of the North American continent, with the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other, is considered so incredible. there are no rivals to challenge them from the north or south. And to get to them from the sides takes forever. This has massive geopolitical significance. It's precisely why America's geopolitical location is so highly valued in modern international politics. And so, on September 3rd, 1783, after winning the final battle, Great Britain had no choice but to recognize their independence. Finally, the United States of America was born. But the country was founded, and for 6 years, there was no president. The office was vacant. Why didn't they elect one for 6 whole years? Remember who a lot of the founders were? People looking out for their own interests. People who wanted to grow their businesses and become politicians. The ka-ching crowd. With guys like that gathered together, creating an absolute figure like a president seemed like a bad idea. That person's power couldn't be too strong, and if possible, they wanted a president they could control. For them to run their businesses, become politicians, or do whatever it took to line their pockets, they needed to be able to pull the president's strings. They couldn't have a president telling them what to do. Because of this issue, they debated the election of a president for 6 years, with almost no progress. Of course, even before the war ended, founding fathers like George Washington had discussed this. If we create a nation called the United States, let's call our head of state a president, not a king.
But there's a reason they initially used the word president. The idea was, this president is a nobody. He's just a guy who moderates meetings and acts as an MC, someone to shake hands and greet foreign dignitaries when they visit. The moderator, the president, is nothing. That was the level they had set for the role. Why would they want to make the president such a figurehead at first? Why was America founded in the first place? It was a country created by people who wanted to protect their own interests, who were annoyed by Britain telling them what to do, and who hated being controlled by the British government. So they needed a leader like a king, but their mindset was, there is no way we're going to let some guy like you tell us what to do in this country we built to line our own pockets. Absolutely not. And that's why they went 6 years without a president in that pathetic state. It was a total mess. That's why even today, the U.S. Congress has so much power, the Senate and the House. The power of Congress was strengthened to prevent the president from running the country however he pleased. This didn't start with some noble idea of democracy or serving the will of the people. It was for their own self-interest. Representatives from their states would enter Congress, right? And for those representatives to protect their interests back home, the president's power had to be weak, and Congress's power had to be strong. So that's the reason for the strong authority of the U.S. Congress. Don't even start with that naive talk about considering the will of the people, thinking of the nation. Not in the late 1700s America. The separation of powers came from this too. It was to stop the president from doing whatever he wanted. We learn that the separation of powers is the foundation of democracy, and obviously a good thing. But when it first appeared in America, it was purely for the purpose of kneecapping of the president. If this form of government had continued without any changes from the late 1700s until now, the United States might have fractured into 50 different countries. It could have completely broken apart state by state. Of course, the U.S. wasn't perfect right after its founding. While they were stuck without a president for 6 years due to these internal conflicts, a rebellion suddenly breaks out in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion. This was a huge deal. With no real president, the bureaucracy wasn't functioning properly, the country was ungovernable, and there was a reason this rebellion happened. What did the Founding Fathers say when they were first trying to rally people to create America? The British government is pushing us around. They're trying to tax us however they want, and who knows what they'll do next. We must become independent and reclaim our sovereignty. That's what they said. But after they became independent, they started levying massive taxes themselves. Why? Because it was right after the war. After a war, a country has no money. The treasury was wrecked. The U.S. had also drained its coffers fighting the Revolutionary War. Why did Britain create the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts before the Boston Tea Party? Because their treasury was empty after the 7 Years' War. It's the exact same thing. After the Revolutionary War, the United States was also broke. What has this country ever done for us? They spouted all that propaganda about creating a better country if we just broke away from Britain, and now they're hitting us with huge taxes too. This kind of resentment exploded into a massive rebellion. The rebellion was quickly suppressed, but what it signified was crystal clear. Wow, the people must be really unhappy with us. There's a ton of resentment simmering against the Founding Fathers. In other words, it meant a second or third rebellion could break out at any time. It was after this rebellion that the conversation about finally picking a president after 6 years without one rapidly gained momentum. They felt a sense of crisis, thinking, okay, we created this country to line our own pockets, but seeing the people rebel like this, we could be in real trouble. If rebellions started popping up everywhere, they could actually be swallowed up by Britain again. And if that happened, everything the Founding Fathers had schemed for, getting rich off the people's blood and sweat, would all go up in smoke. At the time, the U.S. territory was only about this big in the very beginning. This part was a British colony, this was a Spanish colony. That's how it was. So if a massive rebellion broke out here, Britain could just roll down saying, "Oh, you rebels, allow us to help you." They started to think, this could be a real disaster. Forget about the president meddling in our business interests for a second. We need to at least have strong leadership. The mood shifted. Initially, they used the title president because they wanted a figurehead. But after seeing this massive rebellion, they realized they needed a strong leader. So they decided they had to give the president more power, but at the same time they thought, but we can't give him so much power that he can interfere with our business interests. So what did they create? The separation of powers. The separation of powers was born from this idea, we have to prevent the president from ever interfering in our affairs. I won't go into detail about the separation of powers since you all know about it. So, with this system in place, the power of the American presidency was finally strengthened and talk of the first president began in earnest. If we give voting rights to every ignorant farmer and commoner in the name of democracy, it'll be a disaster. The people can have the first round of voting, but the second round, the final decision, must be made by us elites, the wealthy. And with that, the system that still exists to this day was created, that is the Electoral College.
The Electoral College. Why is it that the people don't directly elect the president, but instead go through this extra step with electors chosen by the parties? Well, when this system was first created, what they were really thinking was basically this. We can't just let the ignorant masses decide who the president is. We, the elites, we created this country because we were sick and tired of the British government telling us what to do, and we're not about to let the common folk throw a wrench in the works. That's the kind of thinking that gave us the Electoral College. Anyway, America had its first presidential election right after the Revolutionary War, which was basically a giant coup, right? So what was the vibe back then? What were the powers that be, the ones looking to get their piece of the pie, thinking? Whew, coups are terrifying. In that atmosphere of fear, a consensus probably formed that they needed someone with strong leadership, someone who could unite everyone. So who do you think got elected? Of course, a military man was chosen. He was elected in a climate of fear caused by the coup. And who was that military president? None other than George Washington. Former Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Let's be real. He was technically British, but he was the commander of the rebel army that successfully staged a coup against Britain. This guy originally came from a wealthy family in Virginia. His family owned many black slaves, and as he got older, he worked under the Royal Governor of Virginia, the British governor. So yeah, he's a founding father, but in his youth, he was part of the British military. In the late 1700s, right after the founding of the U.S., George Washington's status was absolutely massive. I mean, as the commander-in-chief, he must have won a ton of battles in the Revolutionary War with his brilliant tactics and strategies, right? So he was revered as this incredibly great figure. George Washington was elected president in 1789. For 6 years before that, they couldn't even elect a president. There were uprisings. You can imagine American society was in a pretty grim state. The first thing he does after becoming president is clean house. He starts cracking down, rounding up anyone involved in potential coups or rebellions to stop them in their tracks. And then he begins to attack the Native Americans indiscriminately. Remember what we talked about before? The American Revolution was a fight between the British Army and the faction of British subjects who wanted to found America. But from the Native Americans' point of view, they felt like those guys trying to create America will probably treat us even worse than the British. Because of that feeling, numerous Native tribes sided with the British Army. And George Washington never forgot that. If we let these Native tribes be, they could become a major threat to us later. It'll be a huge problem if they join a future coup or cause trouble. We need to drive them out first. So, in the process of driving out the Native Americans, the territory expanded quite a bit. The amount of land the U.S. had when Washington took office had nearly doubled by the time he left. So basically, under the pretext of cleaning house, he drove out the Native Americans, expanded the nation's territory, and stabilized public opinion. Washington was president until 1797. He died in 1799. And as soon as he died, all hell broke loose in Europe. Why? Napoleon enters the stage. With the arrival of Napoleon, what came next? The Napoleonic Wars, of course. Europe was a total mess back then, an era of absolute chaos. This is the territory Napoleon controlled during the wars. Look at it now. He had almost all of Spain. Napoleon expanded his empire to the point where he was about to swallow Europe whole. So when we study world history, Napoleon isn't just mentioned because he was famous or great. It's because the snowball effect of his actions had a massive global impact. And what does war mean? It means you're hemorrhaging money, win or lose. You just lose a little less if you win. What happens when a war breaks out? People with jobs suddenly become unemployed. For example, say a convenience store owner in his early 30s gets drafted. He's got to close up shop, right? And just like that, the income from his store vanishes. So when war happens, the economy gets wrecked. War is basically like declaring bankruptcy on yourself. This means with the Napoleonic Wars raging, they had to raise taxes, even though they knew full well their people were being drafted and sent off to die. But here's the thing, war is expensive, and they were out of cash. So what did Napoleon do? He started selling off real estate. He couldn't exactly sell off mainland France, so Napoleon's idea was to sell their colonies. And right at that moment, there was a brand new, freshly independent nation on the scene. Who? The United States, of course. America was there ready to play. And as it happened, the U.S. was looking to buy land. Where? Louisiana. To be precise, they didn't want the entire territory, but way down at the southern tip of that huge chunk of land, there's a port city called New Orleans. The U.S. wanted that port city so badly. Why? Let's say you harvested beaver pelts or corn up here. You could just load them on a boat, float down the river, and boom, You're right in New Orleans. It was the ultimate sweet deal. But whose land was New Orleans? It belonged to France. If the U.S. could just get New Orleans, what would happen? They could just float their goods down the river and sell them with ease. So ever since its founding, the U.S. had been eyeing New Orleans. And Napoleon? He wanted to sell land. The timing was perfect.
So the US says something like, "Hey France, my man, heard you're selling land these days. You've got Louisiana. Just sell us New Orleans. I'm buying." And France is like, "Make me an offer." That was the situation. The US was planning to buy the port of New Orleans for $10 million. They went to France to make the offer, but France, they were sharp negotiators. They thought, "Hey, these guys look like they're willing to pay around $10 million for New Orleans. Let's try this." And then they said, "Yo, America, you're going to buy this for $10 million, right? How about you add another $5 million on top, $15 million total, and you can have all of Louisiana, the whole thing." Wow! They were just trying to buy one port city for $10 million. And for just $5 million more, France was offering them the entire Louisiana territory. That is an absolute steal. The clearance sale was insane. For just $5 million on top of $10 million, they were getting all of this vast land. The reason France was so eager to sell off its entire North American colony was because they were incredibly busy with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Meanwhile, in their colonies, enslaved Black people and local residents were staging rebellions all over the place. We're in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, we're going crazy busy. Who has the time to manage and suppress all that? Better to just sell it off. And so, because Napoleon couldn't manage his colonies while fighting a war, the U.S. bought Louisiana, and its territory expanded enormously. At the time, the average white laborer in America, someone working on a farm, made about $12 a month. And they bought Louisiana for $15 million. $15 million is $1.25 million times 12. They got it for an unbelievably cheap price. So just like that, one war in Europe caused all sorts of crazy things to happen in other countries. And then, about 60 years later, the U.S. ended up buying Alaska. When you think of old Russia, there's one incredible emperor who comes to mind, right? Peter the Great. You can think of him as the emperor who laid the entire foundation for the rise of the Russian Empire, a monumental figure. This guy was definitely a skilled politician. Back in the 1700s, from the perspective of other European nations, the Russian Empire was basically a nobody. The major European powers treated them like barbarians on the fringe. So Russia was constantly trying to shake off that image and expand its influence in Europe, basically saying, "Hey, let us be part of the cool kids club." But from Peter the Great's perspective, he was thinking, look, these guys keep treating us like we're on the outskirts. Maybe sucking up to them isn't the only way. I should see what's cooking elsewhere. With that in mind, he sends a man named Vitus Bering over towards North America. It's freezing over there, right? He basically told him to go check it out and report back. And so, this Vitus Bering finds Alaska. That's why the sea there is called the Bering Sea. All right, now it's our turn to make some money off this Alaska place. And just like that, Russia started making money in Alaska by hunting a ton of seals and selling their oil and fur. But then, something exploded onto the scene. What was it? The Crimean War. Man, Russia fights the Crimean War in the Crimean Peninsula for 3 years, from 1853 to 1856. And in that war, the Russian Empire got completely crushed. And what did I say happens when there's a war? The economy takes a huge hit. Just like that, after its major defeat in the Crimean War, the Russian Empire ended up selling Alaska. But why Alaska, of all the land they had? To understand that, we need to understand the era.
Back in 1867, things like railroads and transportation weren't very developed. Russia's capital, Moscow, is over here, but Alaska is way over there, right? They just physically lacked the ability to manage it. On top of that, what was Canada at the time? A British colony. Russia had just gotten its butt kicked by the British in the Crimean War, and now there's this big British colony called Canada sitting right next to Alaska. Those Brits in Canada might come and attack this place. Most of the Russian army is over here. We'd lose it all before our troops could even get there. That means we'd lose it to Britain for free? Hey, rather than lose it for free, let's just sell it. And so in March of 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. But you have to remember what was going on then. It was only 2 years after the end of the American Civil War. The U.S. was also short on cash. Despite that, when they bought Alaska, people were saying things like, "That president is crazy. He's lost his mind. Why would he buy a giant block of ice, a useless piece of land?" But what happened with Alaska? Turns out it was packed with an insane amount of natural resources. From Russia's perspective, they just wanted to get some fur money out of it, saw that it was mostly ice and hard to manage, and figured it was useless, so they sold it off quick. But later they found out it was an incredible piece of land. Today, 85% of Alaska's entire state budget is funded by selling the oil and natural gas found within its borders. It's estimated that Alaska has somewhere between 4.3 and 16 billion barrels of oil. It's believed to have the largest oil reserves of any region in North America. And it's got a ton of salmon, right? Alaskan salmon is mostly wild-caught. The Norwegian stuff is often farmed. You gotta eat wild, people. So as we get into the mid to late 1800s, Alaska is added to U.S. territory. And if you go way west from the U.S. mainland, there's another territory, isn't it? Where? Hawaii!
Did you know this? Hawaii was eventually taken over by the U.S., right? It's U.S. land now because it was taken. But how exactly did that happen? Let me explain that for you. So, have you ever seen pictures of native Hawaiians? They look a bit like the Maori people. Kind of like this. They have a look that's somewhere between Asian and Black. They're called Polynesians. Many Polynesians live in places like the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and from there to New Zealand and Hawaii. Scholars have different theories about how Polynesians ended up in places like New Zealand and Hawaii. The general idea is that they likely migrated by boat along the islands over tens of thousands or thousands of years. Some went to New Zealand, others went to Hawaii, and that's how the Polynesian people of Hawaii came to be settled there. And Hawaii was a place where people lived in tribes. They were constantly fighting each other. And in 1778, the British explorer James Cook was the first European to arrive. At the time Cook found it, the Hawaiian tribes were in the middle of a civil war, all fighting to become king. Eventually, one tribe came out on top. And who was its chief? King Kamehameha. He's the guy who ended the civil war that started in 1782 and established the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1810. Up to this point, there was nothing in Hawaii. It was just a small island, and obviously there was no advanced civilization or anything like that. But then, as America went through the Industrial Revolution, what happened? They started building things like merchant ships and whaling vessels plated with steel, right? And if the U.S. wanted to trade with China, which way did they have to go? Across the Pacific Ocean. A merchant ship leaving from the U.S. on its way to China needs to take a break somewhere, right? You gotta stop at the service plaza for some coffee and a snack. And what served as that service plaza? Hawaii. And from Hawaii's perspective, having those trade ships use them as a rest stop wasn't bad for their economy either. The problem started when Americans began sending missionaries. Now, why is this important? Because religion has an incredible amount of power. What do you think happens when the people of a nation start to widely adopt a religion like Christianity, which is practiced in Western countries? At first, they might be like, "Who are these Westerners? These white people are here to plunder our country." But soon, that can turn into, "Oh, my dear missionary,
goodness, are you from America? From Europe? Just through that one shared religion, the local people's favorability toward that foreign country skyrockets. And that makes it way easier for the imperialist European nations to do business or just stick a straw in and exploit them. That was often the reason for sending missionaries. So, as more missionaries came to Hawaii, the number of people who believed in Protestantism and Catholicism would have gradually increased. Then, in the 1830s, a man named William Hooper was the first to buy land from Hawaiians and create a sugarcane plantation. Naturally, many other American businessmen followed him to Hawaii. As these foreign-owned plantation businesses started to do well, Hawaiians began to earn dollars. Before the foreigners arrived, Hawaiians lived by spearfishing, gathering fruit, and farming with pretty basic technology. Life was uncertain. But now, if you worked on the sugarcane plantation, they gave you dollars. And with that money, they started buying imported American goods, things they'd never seen in Hawaii before, like crackers, ice cream, cookies. On top of that, in 1875, the U.S. signed a reciprocity treaty with Hawaii for tariff-free trade. If you have tariffs, your products aren't price competitive, right? But if the U.S. imported Hawaiian sugarcane tariff-free, the demand for it within America would soar. But the problem was the Kingdom of Hawaii had no real economic foundation other than the labor for these plantations and its trade with the U.S. They were in a situation where they were completely dependent on the U.S. for their income. In exchange for giving Hawaii these benefits, the U.S. got Pearl Harbor. They didn't completely swallow it whole, but the U.S. government gained exclusive use of it. From America's perspective, what does having access to Pearl Harbor mean? It means they could use Hawaii as a military base. They could buy time by stopping an approaching enemy, and they could resupply things like food right there. Having a military base like that in the middle of the ocean is incredibly important. But remember during the Age of Discovery, why did so many Native Americans in South America die when the Spanish arrived? Disease. Europeans had built up some immunity to their own diseases, but the problem was these were illnesses the Hawaiian people had never encountered before. As huge numbers of Americans came to Hawaii, the native population was exposed to Western diseases and began to die off in massive numbers. So, they had been using Native Hawaiians as cheap labor on the plantations, but now that they were dying off, what did they do? They started a massive PR campaign in Asian countries like China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines saying, "Come make money in Hawaii!" As a result, a large number of Asians went to Hawaii to work in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So, the native Hawaiian population was shrinking due to disease, the number of foreigners running plantations was growing, and the economy was improving. So, what happens next? Inflation. Prices start to rise. The wages Hawaiians were receiving didn't go up much, but the cost of living in Hawaii kept climbing. As prices rose, they would have demanded higher wages, right? But the American and Western businessmen, who were basically running things with guns, would just betray them, beat them, even kill them. The Hawaiian people were powerless, so their protests were useless. On top of that, starting in the mid-1800s, the U.S. and other Western powers started pressuring the Hawaiian kingdom, saying, hey, you need to create a legislature. And what does that do? It creates a new structure of a king and a legislature. Of course, at first they coaxed them into it, saying things like, having a legislature is good for everyone. But the real plan was to use that legislature later to neutralize the king's power. It wasn't some benevolent attempt to spread democracy. Using the legislature they had established, they amended the Hawaiian Kingdom's constitution in 1887, turning the king into a complete puppet. So do you think the Hawaiian royalty just stood by and watched? No. In 1893, the monarch took a stand saying, "How dare you strip me of my power? Restore the old constitution." Now, if the law changed back to give the monarch absolute power, what would happen to all the foreign businessmen in Hawaii? They'd start thinking, whoa, I've worked my butt off to build my business here. Am I about to lose everything? And so they launched a coup to overthrow the Hawaiian monarch. The coup leaders also riled up the native Hawaiians, telling them, if this coup succeeds, your lives will get so much better. And many Hawaiians actually joined in. The coup succeeded, and in 1894, an American named Sanford Dole became the first president. And just like that, a new country called the Republic of Hawaii popped into existence. But Hawaii is just a few islands. It's tiny. It was too precarious to survive as an independent nation, politically, economically, and militarily. It wouldn't have been surprising if another country invaded and took it over. So this guy, the American president of the Republic of Hawaii, spent 4 years lobbying the U.S. government, basically begging, bro, absorb us, please make us part of America. And eventually, the U.S. annexed Hawaii into the Union. That's pretty much how it went down. So, the U.S. has land it bought with money, like Alaska and Louisiana, and land it took through war, but it also has territories that were annexed without spending a dime, just by playing the long game. That's the key takeaway here.
All right. And with that, we're concluding the major series that we've been running since the channel started. From the story of Adam and Eve to Rome, Catholicism, and finally to the founding and territorial expansion of the United States, we've followed one long, connected story. I created this series with the goal of providing a light and easy to digest, but different perspective on the relationship between religion and politics and on key moments in world history. Instead of a textbook view, I wanted to give you a new angle that makes you think, oh, you can look at it that way too. I tried to make it fun, sometimes by being comedic, and other times by using exaggerated expressions. After watching all 9 parts of this series, what are your thoughts? If there was anything lacking, any mistakes, or anything you think could be improved, please be sure to leave a comment. This is a history channel that we're building together with you. I believe these videos will shine even brighter when your thoughts are added to them. I'm preparing more interesting history stories for the future, so please look forward to the next video. Thank you for watching.